My name is Madeline. I am 33 years old, and my mother just looked me in the eye and tried to give away the house I secretly own. I had spent years quietly managing my family finances behind the scenes, fixing their messes, while they treated me like a broken, automated teller machine. Last Sunday, my mother invited me over for tea. I thought it was to thank me for paying off her massive debt. Instead, she took a sip from her expensive china cup, smiled a chilling smile, and told me she was giving the house to my younger brother. She also added that my presence at his graduation party would simply ruin the aesthetic. I did not yell, I did not cry. I just turned to my uncle and asked a single question that would eventually send federal agents to my brother's graduation. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a family that underestimated your worth. Growing up in our affluent suburban neighborhood outside Chicago, image was absolutely everything to my mother, Patricia. She spent her entire life curating the perfect facade of generational wealth, even when the bank accounts were bleeding dry and the credit cards were maxed out. She had remortgaged our family home twice just to fund lavish European vacations and lease luxury cars to keep up with the neighbors. I was the invisible daughter, the forensic accountant, who quietly fixed the numbers, while my brother Justin was the golden child who could do no wrong. I sat in the formal living room that Sunday afternoon, surrounded by expensive imported furniture that I knew was bought on borrowed time. The air in the room felt heavy and suffocating. My sister Rachel sat quietly on the velvet love seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Her husband DeAndre, a highly successful commercial real estate appraiser, sat across from her in the leather armchair. He was the only person in the room who truly saw through my mother and her endless delusions. Patricia carefully placed her teacup on the matching saucer. The sharp clinking sound echoed in the quiet room. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and looked at me with an expression of manufactured pity. "Madeline," she began, her voice dripping with a sickly artificial sweetness. "I know you have been helping out a lot lately. I know you paid off the $860,000 mortgage balance last month to get the bank off our backs. But your father and I have been talking. We are going to give this house to Justin for his graduation present." The room went completely still. I stared at her, processing the sheer audacity of her words. She was completely glossing over the fact that I had just rescued her from total financial ruin and homelessness, acting as if my massive financial intervention was just an expected tribute to her existence. Justin leaned against the marble fireplace mantel, swirling a glass of sparkling water. He had just finished a mediocre business degree program funded entirely by my silent financial contributions, yet he carried himself like a ruthless Wall Street titan. "It just makes sense." "Madeline?" Justin chimed in casually, adjusting the collar of his designer shirt. "I am going to be launching my new tech startup soon. Having a solid luxury real estate asset in my portfolio will show my angel investors that I am stable and grounded. Plus, Mom and Dad want to downsize to a condo anyway. It is the logical move to protect the family legacy." Patricia nodded enthusiastically, completely ignoring my stunned silence. "Exactly. We have to set your brother up for success. And Madeline, about the graduation party next week. We have decided it is best if you do not attend." I slowly raised an eyebrow, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "You are disinviting me from the graduation party that you demanded I pay the catering deposit for." Justin scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Look, it is a high-level networking event for me. I have invited some major venture capitalists and local politicians. No offense, but you are just a corporate accountant. You do not exactly fit the vibe of a high-growth tech founder inner circle. You would just stand in the corner and make people uncomfortable with your serious energy. We need good energy only." A low, deep chuckle broke the suffocating tension in the room. We all turned to look at DeAndre. He had not looked up from his phone the entire time, his long fingers swiftly swiping across the screen. He shook his head, a massive grin spreading across his face. "Hold up, Patricia," DeAndre said, his voice rich with pure amusement. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, finally looking directly at my mother. You are gifting him a house. Yes. DeAndre. Patricia snapped, clearly annoyed that he dared to interrupt her perfect moment. It is an internal family matter, something you would not understand. DeAndre let out a loud, booming laugh, shaking his head in total disbelief. Oh, I understand perfectly well. I appraise commercial and residential houses for a living, Patricia. I deal with property titles, legal liens, and messy foreclosures every single day of my life. Tell me, have you even checked the county public deed registry lately? Patricia narrowed her eyes, her face flushing with sudden anger and defensiveness. I do not need to check anything. I am the homeowner. I have lived in this property for 20 years. DeAndre just looked at me, tapping the side of his phone against his palm. He knew. I had told him exactly what I did a month ago. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and waited for the show to begin. Justin glared at DeAndre, stepping away from the fireplace. Do not disrespect my mother in her own house. When the deed is officially in my name next week, I am not going to tolerate this kind of attitude from you. I let the heavy silence stretch across the room. I watched Justin preen with arrogance and Patricia glow with misplaced pride. They were so blindly confident in their ignorance. They truly thought they had successfully used me, drained my bank accounts, and discarded me. They had absolutely no idea they were standing directly on a legal trapdoor I had meticulously built with my own two hands. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply turned my head toward the dim corner of the room where my Uncle Richard had been sitting in absolute silence, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon. He was a retired estate lawyer, and the only person in our entire family who actually understood the devastating gravity of the documents I had quietly filed with the state. I met his eyes and offered a polite, serene smile. Uncle Richard, I asked quietly, do you want to tell them or should I? Uncle Richard slowly stood up from his leather chair. He looked at my mother with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. No, Madeline, he said softly, shaking his head. Let them enjoy their fantasy for a little while longer. He walked out the front door without another word. I picked up my purse, gave my mother one last polite smile, and walked out right behind him, leaving Patricia and Justin standing there in the living room, utterly confused, but far too arrogant to realize they had just been given their last warning. The very next morning my phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. It was Patricia. I let it ring 3 times, took a deep breath to steady my pulse, and hit answer. I already knew what she wanted. She did not bother with a greeting or a good morning. Madeline, we have a slight problem, she said, her voice carrying that familiar demanding edge she always used when her bank account was overdrawn. The country club needs the final catering deposit for Justin's graduation party by noon today. It is going to be $20,000. I need you to wire it to me immediately. I leaned back in my home office chair and stared at the ceiling. I could not help but laugh out loud. You just disinvited me from this party yesterday, Patricia. You sat in your living room and told me my presence would ruin the aesthetic for Justin and his imaginary investor friends. And now you are calling to demand I pay for the caviar and champagne. It is not a demand. It is your responsibility to this family, she snapped back, completely unfazed by her own hypocrisy. Do not be difficult today. Justin deserves a proper celebration. He is going to be a CEO. You have the money sitting around doing absolutely nothing anyway. I felt that old familiar weight press down on my chest. It was the same suffocating weight I had carried since I was 18 years old. I remembered working 60-hour weeks at a local accounting firm while taking night classes just so Patricia could keep the electricity turned on in that massive house after my father's failed business ventures left us drained. I remembered the year I saved up $5,000 to move into my own apartment only for Patricia to cry and guilt me into giving it to her so Justin could go on a month-long backpacking trip across Europe. She had told me Justin needed cultural exposure for his future career, while I was supposedly just going to be a desk worker anyway. For over a decade, my paychecks had funded their luxury car leases, Justin expensive braces, and Patricia endless country club lunches. I had been their personal bank vault, silently absorbing their financial ruin while they paraded around as high society elites. I am not sending you $20,000 for a party I am not allowed to attend, I said calmly, keeping all emotion out of my voice. Patricia's tone instantly shifted from entitled to venomous. Her voice dropped to a threatening, calculated hiss. Listen to me very carefully, Madeline. If you do not send that money right now, I will call Aunt Susan, Uncle Robert, and everyone else in this extended family. I will tell them exactly why you are not at the party. I will tell them you are a jealous, bitter spinster who is actively trying to sabotage her own brother's success because no man wants you and you have nothing else going on in your miserable, lonely life. I will spin such a story that you will be completely ostracized. You will not have a single family member left who will even look you in the eye. She was using her favorite weapon, public humiliation. In her mind, the threat of being outcast from our affluent, image-obsessed family was the ultimate punishment. She thought I was still that terrified 20-year-old girl who desperately wanted her mother approval and feared family gossip. But I was not that girl anymore. I was a senior forensic accountant who spent my days dismantling corporate fraudsters and tracking hidden offshore accounts. I knew exactly how to play this game. I let the silence hang on the line just long enough to make her sweat, letting her believe her threat had paralyzed me. Then I let out a heavy sigh, perfectly faking defeat. Fine, I said, my voice deliberately quiet and submissive. I will send the money. Patricia let out a loud, triumphant huff. I knew you would see reason. Have it in my account by noon. Not so fast, I interrupted, my tone shifting to purely strictly business. 20,000 is a large sum. My bank has flagged my account for large unexplained transfers before, especially to family members. If you want this money today, it has to go through an official channel to avoid triggering an IRS audit on my end. I am going to wire it into a verified escrow account managed by a third-party trust. An escrow account, she repeated, sounding slightly suspicious, but mostly just impatient. Why can you not just use the normal banking app on your phone like you usually do? Because I am not getting investigated by the federal government for your catering bill. I lied smoothly. The escrow service is instant once verified. I will email you a secure digital wire transfer form. All you have to do is check the boxes digitally, sign your name, and the funds will be released directly to your account. It is standard compliance procedure for high net worth transfers. Patricia heard the words high net worth, and her ego immediately took over, overriding any shred of common sense she might have had. Fine, send the email. But hurry up, the event coordinator is waiting. I hung up the phone and opened my laptop. I did not open my personal banking portal. Instead, I logged into a highly secure, heavily monitored trust account that I had set up weeks ago. I drafted the document carefully. The terms were explicitly clear. By signing, the recipient swore under penalty of perjury that the funds were being requested for legitimate purposes, legally confirming their identity, their social security number, and their exact physical location via IP address tracking. More importantly, this specific financial portal was linked to an active federal fraud investigation file I had quietly opened a month prior. Because the funds were crossing state lines through a federally insured institution, any false pretenses or fraudulent information tied to this transaction would automatically elevate the matter to federal wire fraud. I hit send. Less than 2 minutes later, I received a notification ping on my screen. Patricia had opened the document. I watched the real-time tracking dashboard on my monitor. She did not read a single paragraph. She did not scroll through the terms of service. She did not read the federal wire regulations clearly printed in bold text at the bottom of the page. Blinded completely by greed and the desperate need to maintain her wealthy facade for her friends, she simply scrolled straight to the bottom, typed her full legal name, and clicked accept. A bright green check mark appeared on my screen. The digital signature was permanently verified. The IP address was logged and time-stamped. The funds were instantly locked, routed, and recorded by the system. She had done it. She had eagerly and willingly signed her name to a federally tracked financial document. She thought she was cleverly extorting her spinster daughter for $20,000 to throw a lavish party. In reality, she had just handed me the final, undeniable piece of evidence I needed to prove a pattern of financial manipulation and wire fraud. I leaned back in my chair, took a sip of my morning coffee, and smiled. The federal trap was perfectly set, and she had walked right into it without a second thought. Now it was time for Justin to go to the office and try to claim his new house. It was Tuesday afternoon when the heavy glass doors of my firm swung open with enough force to make the front desk receptionist jump out of her chair. I was sitting in my corner office deep into a complex audit of a corrupt hedge fund when I heard the unmistakable sound of my brother echoing down the quiet carpeted hallway. Justin did not believe in indoor voices, and he certainly did not believe in professional boundaries. He marched past the security desk, ignoring the frantic protests of the administrative staff, and pushed my office door wide open without bothering to knock. He was dressed in a tailored suit that I knew for a fact was charged to Patricia's maxed-out credit card. He looked around my office with a prominent sneer, completely unimpressed by the panoramic view of the city skyline or the heavy mahogany desk that I had earned through blood, sweat, and endless 60-hour work weeks. "We need to talk," he announced loudly, dropping a thick manila folder right on top of my keyboard. I did not flinch. I slowly took off my reading glasses and looked up at him. "Justin, this is a secure corporate environment. You cannot just barge in here. I have client confidentiality protocols to maintain." Justin waved his hand in the air, brushing off my statement as if I were a complaining child. "Relax, Madeline. I am not here to steal your little spreadsheets. I just need you to handle some administrative busywork for me. Mom said you were being difficult on the phone yesterday, so I figured I would come down here and sort this out face to face like a real executive." He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them aggressively across my desk. I glanced down and immediately recognized the documents. One was the annual county property tax assessment for the house. The other was a heavily marked-up financing agreement from a high-end luxury auto dealership. "I need you to take care of this tax bill by Friday," he ordered, tapping his index finger against the official county seal. "Since Mom and Dad are transferring the deed into my name, the county just sent over the reassessed tax rate. It is ridiculous, honestly. They expect me to pay 10 grand out of pocket. I am launching a tech company. All my capital is tied up in seed funding and operational costs. I do not have the liquidity to deal with this boring municipal garbage. You handle the taxes every year anyway, so just pay it and send me the receipt." I stared at him, genuinely marveling at the sheer density of his entitlement. He truly believed that acquiring a house meant someone else would simply continue paying for its existence. "And the car loan?" I asked, gesturing to the dealership paperwork. Justin puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "That is the other thing. I went to the dealership this morning. I am picking up a brand new Porsche Carrera, black on black. It is an absolute necessity for my personal brand. When I pull up to meetings with venture capitalists, I need to project massive success. I need them to know I am a winner before I even walk into the boardroom." The problem is, the finance guy at the dealership was being a total amateur. He looked at my credit history and said I needed a co-signer with a verified high income and a flawless credit score. He leaned across my desk, invading my personal space. "So you are going to co-sign this loan for me? It is just a formality. I will make the monthly payments once my startup gets its first major funding round. You will not even have to do anything except put your name on the dotted line." I looked past his shoulder and noticed that several of my colleagues had gathered outside the glass walls of my office. My firm was not a loud place. The screaming and demanding had attracted an immediate audience. Senior partners and junior analysts alike were watching the spectacle unfold. Justin noticed them looking. Instead of lowering his voice or showing even a hint of embarrassment, he decided to play directly to the crowd. He stood up straighter and raised his voice so everyone in the bullpen could hear him clearly. "Look, Madeline, I know you are probably a little jealous," he projected, making sure his words carried through the open door. "I get it. You sit in this boring little glass box all day, punching numbers into a machine and looking at other people's money. You are a glorified calculator. You play it safe. But I am an entrepreneur. I take risks. I am actually building a legacy. The least you can do is support the family member who is actually going to make a massive impact on the world. Just sign the paper and pay the tax bill. Do not make this a whole emotional thing." A few of my colleagues exchanged wide-eyed glances. They knew exactly who I was. They knew I was the lead forensic investigator who had recently put two corrupt corporate executives behind bars for embezzlement. Calling me a glorified calculator was like calling a neurosurgeon a glorified barber. I did not defend myself. I did not raise my voice or try to put him in his place in front of my coworkers. Arguing with a fool only proves there are two. Instead, I calmly opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I pulled out a thick-bound copy of the state municipal property tax code. It was a dense, heavy brick of legal jargon. I stood up, picked up the property tax bill he had thrown on my desk and placed it neatly on top of the tax code book. I slid both items across the desk until they hit his chest. "I am not paying this bill, Justin," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a chilling authority that made him blink. "And I am certainly not co-signing a loan for a luxury sports car you cannot afford." Justin's face turned a dark shade of red. He opened his mouth to shout again, but I held up a single finger, stopping him dead in his tracks. "You want to be a homeowner?" I continued, maintaining absolute, unwavering eye contact. "You want to be the big executive who owns luxury real estate? Well, congratulations. Here is your first lesson in real estate asset management. Owners pay taxes, Justin. You want the house, you pay the state. Let us see exactly how you handle it." I sat back down in my chair, picked up my reading glasses, and turned my attention back to my computer monitor. "I am working, Justin. See yourself out before I have corporate security escort you from the building." For a brief second, I saw a flicker of genuine panic behind his arrogant eyes. He looked down at the massive tax bill, realizing for the very first time that the financial safety net he had relied on his entire life had just been completely removed. But his fragile ego was far too large to let him back down in front of an audience. He snatched the papers off my desk, glaring at me with pure hatred. "You are going to regret this," he hissed under his breath. "When I am a billionaire, do not come begging me for a handout." He turned around and stormed out of my office, walking stiffly past the staring faces of my colleagues. He pushed the glass doors open and disappeared down the hallway. I watched him leave, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. He was walking out of my office holding a tax bill for a house he did not own, dreaming of a car he could never buy, completely confident in his delusion. I took a deep breath, smiled to myself, and went right back to my audit. Justin had just taken his first step into the real world, and he had absolutely no idea the ground beneath him was already gone. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, Justin and Patricia walked through the heavy, polished doors of First Century Bank. I knew every detail of this disastrous meeting because the senior loan officer handling their appointment was a former colleague of mine, a meticulous woman who strictly followed federal lending guidelines. My mother had scheduled the meeting under the pretense of a standard wealth management consultation, but her actual goal was to secure a massive line of credit. Justin strutted into the bank lobby like he already owned the building, wearing his fitted suit and carrying a leather briefcase that was completely empty. Patricia walked right beside him, clutching a designer handbag she had purchased on a maxed-out credit card, projecting the image of a wealthy matriarch making a generous investment in her brilliant son. They bypassed the regular teller lines and demanded to be seated in a private glass-enclosed office. The loan officer politely offered them coffee and pulled up their file. Justin immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed, completely nonsensical pitch about his new tech startup. He threw around meaningless buzzwords about artificial intelligence, blockchain integration, and disruptive market synergies. He spoke rapidly, trying to overwhelm the loan officer with his aggressive confidence, demanding a $200,000 home equity line of credit to fund his initial operating costs, and though he left this part out of his presentation, to pay for his new luxury sports car. Patricia sat beside him, nodding proudly. She placed her manicured hands on the mahogany desk and informed the loan officer that she was putting up the family home as collateral for the loan. She explained that the house had just been fully paid off, conveniently omitting the fact that she believed I was the one who had paid it, and declared that the property held nearly $1 million in pure equity. She demanded that the paperwork be expedited so the funds could be deposited into Justin's account before his graduation party on Saturday. The loan officer smiled politely, ignoring Justin's ridiculous business pitch, and turned her attention to her computer monitor. She typed in the property address and Patricia's social security number to pull up the official county deed and the current lien status. For a few seconds, the only sound in the office was the clicking of the keyboard. Then the clicking stopped. The loan officer frowned, adjusting her glasses as she stared at the screen. She pressed a few more keys to refresh the database, thinking there had been a system error. "Is there a problem?" Patricia asked, her tone already laced with impatient condescension. "We have an incredibly busy schedule today." The loan officer looked up, her professional smile replaced by a look of genuine confusion. "Ma'am, there seems to be a discrepancy with the collateral you are offering. You cannot take out a home equity loan against this property." Justin let out a loud, obnoxious sigh, throwing his hands up in the air. "Look, we are not asking for a small personal loan. We are talking about high-level corporate finance. The house is fully paid off. My mother is the sole owner. Just process the application and stop wasting our time." The loan officer did not flinch. She had dealt with entitled clients before, but the data on her screen was absolute. She looked directly at my mother. "Ma'am, according to the county registry and our internal financial database, your name is not on the deed to this house. You do not hold any equity in this property." The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. She sat frozen in her chair for a split second before her shock morphed into explosive, uncontrollable rage. "That is completely absurd!" she screamed, slamming her hand down on the desk so hard it rattled the coffee cups. "I have lived in that house for over 20 years. It is my home. You are just a low-level bank employee who does not know how to operate a computer. Get your branch manager in here right now. I want you fired for this sheer incompetence." Justin stood up, leaning aggressively over the desk, pointing a finger at the loan officer. "You are intentionally stalling because you do not want to approve a massive loan for a young entrepreneur. You are looking at a future billionaire, and you are playing games with my mother property. Fix the error right now before I sue this entire branch for discrimination and gross negligence." The commotion was so loud that customers in the lobby stopped what they were doing to stare at the glass office. The branch manager even stepped out of his office down the hall ready to intervene. But the loan officer remained perfectly calm. She did not call for security. She did not argue back. She simply reached out, grasped the edges of her large computer monitor, and physically turned the screen around so it was facing directly at Patricia and Justin. She pointed a manicured finger at a line of bold red text flashing across the official property record. "I assure you there is no error," the loan officer said, her voice dropping to a cold, authoritative register. "The system is perfectly accurate. Ma'am, you did not pay off your mortgage. You defaulted on your loan obligations entirely 6 months ago. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings, but before the eviction could be finalized, your entire debt was purchased outright by a private corporate entity." Patricia stared at the screen, her eyes wide with mounting terror as the words blurred together. "A private entity," she stammered, her voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant volume. "What are you talking about?" The loan officer tapped the screen. "Your debt was bought out by a private LLC. They paid the bank the outstanding balance in full, which means they instantly absorbed the title and the deed. You do not own a single brick of that house. You are currently legally classified as a tenant at will living in a property owned by a corporate landlord. And since you cannot use a house you do not own as collateral, this loan application is officially denied." Justin's jaw dropped open. He looked at the screen, then at his mother. The reality of his ruined sports car and fake startup crashing down around him. "But who owns the LLC?" Justin demanded, his voice cracking with panic. "Who bought the debt?" The loan officer pulled the monitor back around and hit the print key. She handed a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was the public record of the LLC registration. Justin snatched the paper from her hand, his eyes frantically scanning the document until they landed on the registered agent and primary shareholder of the company. He stopped breathing. Patricia leaned over his shoulder to read the name, and a sickening wave of realization washed over her face. There, printed in stark black ink, was my name. Madeline. Patricia tried to speak, but only a dry gasp left her throat. She looked wildly around the glass office, as if hoping someone would tell her this was a practical joke. She grabbed the paper from Justin and stared at my name, her mind violently rejecting the truth. "This is fraud!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing through the quiet bank lobby. "She forged this. She stole my house behind my back. Call the police right now. Call the FBI. My daughter is a criminal who used her accounting firm to hack into the county records." The loan officer stood up, her patience completely exhausted. "Ma'am, a debt buyout is a standard, fully legal financial transaction. You failed to make your payments for 6 consecutive months. The bank had every right to sell that debt to any willing buyer to recoup our losses. The buyer just happened to be your daughter corporate entity. If she had not purchased the debt, you would have been physically evicted by the county sheriff 3 months ago. She did not steal your house. She saved you from being thrown out onto the street. Now I must ask you to lower your voice, or I will have security escort you off the premises immediately." Justin looked like he was going to vomit. His custom suit suddenly looked ridiculous on him. The empty leather briefcase felt like a heavy anchor in his hands. Without another word, he turned around and practically ran out of the office, pushing past the staring customers in the lobby to escape the overwhelming humiliation. Patricia stood there for another second, clutching her designer bag, completely stripped of her power and her pride. She snatched the piece of paper off the desk, turned on her heel, and marched out of the bank with her head down, utterly humiliated, in front of the exact high society crowd she tried so desperately to impress. The ground beneath them had finally shattered, and they were in total freefall. 2 hours later, I was sitting at a quiet corner table of a sunlit bistro downtown. I had invited my sister Rachel and her husband DeAndre out for a late lunch. Rachel was stirring her iced tea, looking more relaxed than I had seen her in months. She had always been the quiet middle child, eager to please, but deeply anxious around our mother. DeAndre, on the other hand, was happily tearing into a massive club sandwich, completely unbothered by the usual family drama. We were discussing Rachel's recent promotion at her marketing firm, completely detached from the financial apocalypse that had just detonated across town at the bank. I knew the explosion was coming. I just did not know exactly when the shockwave would hit my table. The bell above the bistro door chimed violently as the heavy glass door was practically ripped off its hinges. I looked up from my grilled chicken salad just in time to see Patricia and Justin storming through the dining room. Patricia's face was blotchy and red, her meticulously styled hair slightly disheveled from the manic, reckless drive-over. Justin was trailing closely behind her, looking less like a confident tech founder ready to conquer Silicon Valley, and more like a panicked child who had just been caught stealing from a cash register. They marched straight toward our table, moving with aggressive purpose, completely ignoring the startled looks of the waitstaff and the other patrons enjoying their peaceful afternoon meals. Patricia did not even bother to say hello to Rachel, who immediately shrank back into the leather booth. Patricia slammed her hands down on the edge of our table, knocking over a small glass vase of decorative flowers. Water spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, rapidly soaking into the linen napkins. "You deceptive, conniving little fraud!" Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with a terrifying mixture of rage and sheer panic. She leaned over the table, her eyes wide and wild, ignoring the water dripping onto her designer blouse. "I know exactly what you did. I just came from the loan office at the bank. You hacked into their secure system and forged a corporate buyout to steal my house from right under me. I am going to have you arrested, Madeline. I am calling my attorney right now, and I am going to see you locked in a federal prison for corporate espionage." Rachel gasped aloud, her eyes darting frantically between me and our mother. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling with sudden fear. "What did Madeline do?" Justin pointed a shaking finger at me, trying desperately to maintain his false bravado. "Your sister is a criminal, Rachel. She set up a fake shell company and tricked the bank into giving her the deed to our family home. She is trying to leave Mom and Dad out on the street so she can steal my inheritance. She is a psychopath." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to match their hysterical, frantic energy. I slowly picked up my dry linen napkin, calmly wiped the corners of my mouth, and set it down neatly beside my plate. I looked up at Patricia holding her furious, erratic gaze with absolute unbothered stillness. I did not hack anything, Patricia. I said, keeping my tone as casual and flat as if we were discussing the local weather forecast. And there was absolutely no forgery involved. It was a standard corporate acquisition. You went into severe default. You stopped paying your mortgage 6 months ago because you were too busy leasing a new Mercedes and booking luxury spa retreats. The bank was legally preparing to foreclose on the property and forcefully evict you by the end of the quarter. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, letting the harsh reality of my words sink into the suddenly quiet restaurant environment. I did not pay off your mortgage. Mother, I continued, enunciating every single word precisely so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. My limited liability company bought your defaulted debt directly from the bank at a steep discount. I absorbed the title and the deed. So in this exact moment, I am not your daughter. I am your primary lien holder, and as of today, you are exactly 180 days late on rent. The silence that followed was absolute and crushing. The background noise of the bistro seemed to completely vanish into thin air. Patricia's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. She looked like she had just been struck by physical lightning. The grand illusion of wealth she had spent decades meticulously building was officially dead, and the executioner was the daughter she had always treated like a disposable asset. Suddenly, a loud booming laugh shattered the tense quiet. DeAndre slapped his large hand down on the table, throwing his head back in pure, unadulterated joy. He started clapping a slow, heavy applause that echoed loudly through the dining room. "Oh, this is a masterclass!" DeAndre roared, wiping a tear of laughter from his eye. He looked at me with deep, genuine admiration, then turned his gaze to my brother, who was standing completely frozen in absolute horror. DeAndre pointed a large finger directly at Justin's chest. "Justin, bro, you are not a homeowner. You are a squatter." Rachel covered her mouth with both hands, finally understanding the massive scale of Patricia's financial deception. "Mom," Rachel whispered, her voice laced with profound disappointment. "You lost the house. You actually went broke, lost the family home, and you were going to let Madeline take the blame for your failure." Patricia could not look Rachel in the eye. She stood there trembling uncontrollably, her pride entirely stripped away in front of her two daughters and her son-in-law. She had always prided herself on being the ultimate authority figure, the wealthy matriarch who controlled everyone through financial leverage and psychological manipulation. Now she was nothing more than a delinquent tenant staring down the barrel of a legal eviction. "You are going to fix this," Madeline Patricia finally managed to choke out, though her voice lacked any of its usual commanding power. It sounded like a desperate plea wrapped in a pathetic, hollow threat. "You are going to sign that deed back over to me by the end of the week. Family does not do this to family. Family does not lie about their financial ruin. Demand $20,000 for a party and try to give away a house they do not legally own," I replied softly, my voice cold as ice. "You have 30 days to figure out your next move, Patricia. I suggest you start packing boxes instead of planning graduation parties." Justin grabbed his mother by the arm, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. "Come on, Mom," he muttered, tugging her forcefully away from the table. "We need to go. We need to figure this out. She is completely insane." Patricia let herself be pulled away, her posture completely defeated, her shoulders slumped forward. They practically scurried out of the bistro, a stark, humiliating contrast to the aggressive way they had stormed in just minutes prior. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, leaving a peaceful, satisfying quiet in their wake. I calmly picked up my fork and took another bite of my salad. DeAndre let out one final chuckle, raising his glass of iced water toward me in a silent, respectful toast. Rachel simply stared at me in awe, realizing for the first time that the abusive family dynamics we had suffered under for years had just been permanently destroyed. I left the bistro feeling a profound sense of clarity. The drive back to my apartment was peaceful, but I knew the silence was only temporary. Patricia was a cornered animal, and in our family, a cornered animal did not retreat. They called the pack. I had barely unlocked my front door and kicked off my heels when the assault began. It started with a single sharp chime from my cell phone, then another, then three more in rapid succession. Within 60 seconds, my phone was vibrating so violently against the kitchen counter that it sounded like a small drill. I walked over, poured myself a glass of iced water, and picked up the device. The screen was flooded with notifications from our extended family group chat, ironically named The Bloodline. Patricia had fired the first shot, and it was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. She had typed out a massive, multi-paragraph manifesto detailing my supposed crimes against the family. According to her deeply twisted narrative, she had simply missed one or two mortgage payments due to a minor banking error. In her version of reality, I had maliciously used my corporate accounting credentials to hack into the bank network, exploit a hidden legal loophole, and steal the deed to the family home out from under her. She painted herself as the helpless, trusting mother, and Justin as the innocent collateral damage, claiming I was trying to leave them homeless on the streets out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. It was a spectacular lie, completely ignoring the 6 months of deliberate default and the legal reality of a debt buyout. But in my family, the truth never mattered. The only thing that mattered was who cried the loudest and who played the victim the best. Patricia was a seasoned professional at both. Almost instantly, the flying monkeys descended. The group chat exploded with outrage from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had happily benefited from Patricia's lavish debt-funded parties for years. Aunt Brenda was the first to reply, typing in all capital letters. She called me a greedy, cold-hearted monster who had finally shown her true colors. She demanded that I immediately transfer the house back to my mother or face the wrath of God. Cousin Kyle, who was currently unemployed and living in his parents' basement, chimed in to call me a corporate parasite. He accused me of destroying the family legacy just to pad my own bank account. The messages poured in by the dozen. Some tried to use religious guilt, telling me to pray for forgiveness. Others used emotional blackmail, reminding me of all the sacrifices Patricia had supposedly made for me when I was a child. The sheer volume of the hatred was staggering. For a brief moment, standing in my quiet kitchen, I felt a familiar ghost of anxiety tighten my chest. This was the exact tactic they had used to control me my entire life. Isolate, attack, and overwhelm until I caved in and apologized just to make the screaming stop. But as I read through the vitriol, the anxiety evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment. I was not a scared child anymore. I was a forensic auditor. I spent my professional life dismantling complex financial fraud networks run by ruthless criminals. A group chat full of angry, uninformed relatives was nothing more than a poorly organized data set. Then the direct messages started. My phone began to ring endlessly as family members bypassed the group chat to attack me privately. I did not answer a single call. I let every single one go straight to voicemail. When the ringing finally stopped, I had 14 new voice messages. I carried my phone into my home office, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I did not type a single word in response. I did not try to defend myself or explain the intricacies of property law to people who were committed to misunderstanding me. Arguing with them would only give them the emotional reaction they desperately craved. It would validate their attack. My silence, on the other hand, would absolutely madden them. I created a new secure folder on my encrypted hard drive and titled it Evidence of Harassment Exhibit B. I plugged my phone into the computer and went to work. I took precise, high-resolution screenshots of every single message in the group chat, making sure the timestamps and phone numbers were clearly visible. I captured Aunt Brenda unhinged demands, Cousin Kyle insults, and Patricia original defamatory manifesto. I dragged every image into the folder. Next, I opened my voicemail inbox. I played the messages one by one on speakerphone. Uncle Gary left a slurred, aggressive recording, threatening to come to my office and drag me out by my hair if I did not fix what I had done to his sister. Another aunt left a sobbing, theatrical message dramatically claiming my actions were going to give Patricia a fatal heart attack. I did not flinch at the venom in their voices. I simply downloaded the audio files, labeled them with the caller names and times, and dropped them directly into Exhibit B. The meticulous process of cataloging their abuse was deeply therapeutic. With every file I saved, I was legally documenting their harassment. They thought they were punishing me, but in reality, they were just handing me a silver platter of digital evidence. In the eyes of the law, cyberbullying, coordinated harassment, and threats of physical violence were serious offenses. If any of them decided to escalate this beyond angry text messages, I now had a pristine, legally admissible record of their coordinated attack. I spent an hour perfectly organizing the folder. When I was finished, my phone was still buzzing with the occasional angry text, but the initial tidal wave of rage had subsided. They were waiting for me to break. They were sitting by their phones expecting me to send a tearful apology or a desperate defense. I closed my laptop, walked back into the kitchen, and finished my glass of water. Let them scream into the void. Let them believe Patricia lies and work themselves into a furious frenzy. Their blind loyalty to a manipulative liar was their own fatal flaw. They had chosen their side without asking a single question, and soon enough they were all going to find themselves standing on the wrong side of a federal investigation. I turned my phone on silent, placed it face down on the counter, and enjoyed the rest of my evening in absolute uninterrupted peace. Justin had hired a lawyer, and I needed to be well rested for the legal circus that was about to arrive. The next morning, Wednesday, began exactly as I had anticipated. I was sitting at my desk at the firm, reviewing a complex corporate audit, when my receptionist buzzed my intercom to announce a priority courier delivery. A young man in an overly tight suit walked into my office and handed me a thick, glossy envelope. The return address, printed in bold gold lettering, read, "The Law Offices of Rex Cannon." Anyone who watched local television after midnight knew exactly who Rex Cannon was. He was the loud, aggressive personal injury attorney who pointed at the camera and promised to fight the big guys to get you the cash you deserve. Justin could not even afford a real corporate litigator. He had hired a cheap billboard lawyer. I opened the envelope and pulled out a 3-page cease and desist letter. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, at least to someone who did not actually understand the law. The document aggressively accused me of predatory financial practices, emotional distress, and corporate espionage. It demanded that I immediately sign a quitclaim deed, transferring the property entirely into Justin's name within 48 hours. If I failed to comply, Rex Cannon promised to file a massive civil lawsuit that would ruin my professional career, drain my bank accounts, and expose me to criminal liability. The letter was printed on heavy, expensive parchment paper, clearly designed to terrify a normal person into immediate submission. Instead of feeling terrified, I felt a deep, genuine wave of amusement. Justin had clearly marched into that office and fed this ambulance chaser the exact same ridiculous story Patricia had posted in the family group chat. He had conveniently omitted the fact that I legally purchased a defaulted debt from a federally insured bank. I did not bother drafting a written response. I picked up my office phone, dialed the number printed in bold red font at the top of the letterhead, and pressed the speakerphone button. A receptionist answered with a rehearsed, overly enthusiastic greeting. I firmly stated my name and informed her that I was calling regarding a formal notice of impending litigation from Mr. Cannon. I was transferred immediately. "This is Rex Cannon," a deep, booming voice answered, perfectly matching his television persona. "I assume you are calling to discuss the settlement terms regarding your brother property, Madeline. I highly advise you to comply with our demands. We have a rock-solid case of financial manipulation here, and juries do not look kindly on family members who steal from each other." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and stared out at the city skyline outside my window. "Mr. Cannon," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and professional, "I am not calling to settle anything. I am calling to offer you a singular opportunity to save your license to practice law." There was a sharp, sudden pause on the other end of the line. "Excuse me?" The lawyer scoffed, his booming voice losing a fraction of its aggressive confidence. Are you threatening me? I am educating you, I corrected smoothly. My name is Madeline. I am a senior forensic accountant and a certified fraud examiner. It appears your client, my brother, forgot to mention my actual profession when he hired you. He also conveniently forgot to mention the actual nature of the transaction you are currently disputing. I pulled up the digital copy of the county property code on my monitor, though I already had the statutes completely memorized. First, let us discuss State Property Code Section 51, governing the assignment of real estate liens. I did not seize a property through a loophole. My corporate entity legally purchased a defaulted promissory note directly from First Century Bank. The chain of title is absolute, verified, and publicly recorded at the county clerk office. Second, under the Uniform Commercial Code Article 9. I hold the perfected security interest. Your client has zero legal standing to demand a quitclaim deed for a property he has never owned, never financed, and never maintained. Rex Cannon was completely silent. The blustering, confident television persona had vanished entirely into thin air. I did not stop. I pressed my advantage, and finally I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone. Let us discuss your own professional liability. Sending a formal legal demand for the transfer of $1 million asset based entirely on fabricated claims without conducting a basic title search constitutes a direct violation of Rule 3.1 for meritorious claims and contentions. Furthermore, demanding I surrender physical property under the threat of a baseless civil suit borders on extortion under federal statutes. If you do not formally withdraw this cease and desist by noon today, I will personally file a comprehensive grievance with the State Bar Association. I will include a detailed forensic breakdown of your failure to perform due diligence, and I will ensure your firm is investigated for participating in an extortion attempt. The silence stretched for another 5 agonizing seconds. When Rex Cannon finally spoke, his voice was small, tight, and completely stripped of its arrogant bravado. He sounded like a man who had just realized he was standing on a live landmine. Miss, he started, clearing his throat nervously. My firm was operating strictly on the information provided by our client. Justin explicitly assured me that you had illegally altered the deed during a standard family refinancing process. We were completely unaware of the debt acquisition from the bank. Well, now you are aware, I replied coldly. So what is your next move, counselor? I am officially withdrawing as Justin legal counsel. Effective immediately, he backpedaled rapidly, desperate to distance himself from the impending disaster. My office will send you a formal notice of withdrawal within the hour. We will not be pursuing this matter any further. I sincerely apologize for the miscommunication. Make sure you copy me on the email you send to Justin, I instructed. Have a wonderful afternoon, Mr. Cannon. I pressed the button to end the call. Exactly 12 minutes later, a new email popped into my inbox. It was from the law offices of Rex Cannon, officially retracting the cease and desist letter. Attached was a forwarded copy of the email he had just sent to Justin. I clicked on it and read the contents with deep satisfaction. Cannon did not just drop Justin as a client. He ruthlessly reprimanded my brother for lying to legal counsel, warned him that he was facing legitimate eviction, and demanded immediate payment for the 2 hours of consultation time. I could perfectly picture Justin sitting in his expensive unpaid suit, staring at his phone screen in absolute panic. His aggressive legal strategy had just imploded before it even began. He had tried to bully a forensic auditor with a cheap television lawyer, and it had backfired spectacularly. He was now entirely without legal representation, entirely without leverage, and entirely out of his depth. The walls were rapidly closing in on him and Patricia. They were completely out of options, but they were also incredibly stubborn. I knew Patricia would rather destroy the family entirely than admit defeat to the daughter she despised. She was about to make her most desperate and destructive move yet. Thursday morning brought the exact kind of theatrical, unhinged explosion I had been waiting for. I was sitting at my kitchen island sipping a fresh cup of dark roast coffee when my laptop chimed with a high-priority email notification. It was from Patricia. She had bypassed the chaotic family group chat entirely and gone straight for the master family mailing list, She had carbon copied over 60 people. Aunts, uncles, second cousins, and even a few of her wealthy country club acquaintances were all on the receiving end of her desperate power play. The subject line was written in all capital letters, Notice of Family Severance. I opened the email and read through what could only be described as a manifesto of pure narcissistic rage. She wrote that I had suffered a complete mental breakdown. She claimed my deep-seated jealousy over Justin and his incredible entrepreneurial success had driven me to commit unforgivable acts of financial sabotage against my own blood. She painted herself as a grieving, heartbroken mother who had tried everything to save her troubled daughter only to be betrayed in the most cruel way possible. Then came the grand finale, typed in a bold, aggressive red font. Madeline is dead to us. She is no longer my daughter, and she is no longer a part of this family. Anyone who speaks to her, texts her, or acknowledges her existence in any capacity is permanently banned from Justin graduation party this Saturday. Furthermore, anyone who sides with her will be cut out of our lives and our estate forever. Choose your loyalties wisely. I read the email twice. I did not feel a single pang of rejection. I did not feel sad or abandoned. I actually laughed softly into my coffee mug. Patricia was attempting to use a social event as a weapon of mass compliance. She honestly believed that the threat of missing out on cheap champagne and stale hors d'oeuvres would force the entire family to fall in line and turn their backs on me. She was using the promise of a fake inheritance from a bankrupt estate to buy their loyalty. What she did not realize was that she was simply doing my job for me. She was intentionally isolating herself in a room full of people right before the floor was scheduled to completely collapse. My phone rang loudly on the marble counter. It was DeAndre. I tapped the screen to answer and immediately heard his booming, infectious laughter echoing through the speaker. "Did you see the morning paper?" DeAndre asked, clearly thoroughly entertained by the sheer absurdity of the situation. "She said you are dead to us. I did not know we were living in a medieval soap opera. Are Rachel and I supposed to wear black to the graduation party to officially mourn your passing?" I smiled, leaning against the counter. "You and Rachel are definitely still going to that party," I told him, making sure my voice carried absolute certainty. "Do not let her ban scare you away. You need to be inside that banquet hall on Saturday." "Oh, I would not miss this for the world," DeAndre chuckled. "Rachel was panicking a little, wondering if we should boycott the event to support you." I told her absolutely not. I told her Madeline has a playbook, and we just need to sit in the bleachers and watch the execution. Just give me a heads up before you drop the hammer so I can make sure my phone is recording. I promised him I would ended the call and headed out the door. An hour later, I arrived at my office. The morning sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, peaceful shadows across my heavy mahogany desk. I set my briefcase down, woke up my computer monitor, and opened a highly secured digital file I had been drafting and perfecting for the past 48 hours. It was not a simple warning letter. It was a 30-page legal juggernaut. It was the official notice of foreclosure, eviction, and asset seizure. I had spent hours meticulously cross-referencing state property laws, county municipal codes, and federal tenant regulations to ensure there was not a single loophole, not a single missing comma, and absolutely zero room for negotiation. The document detailed the exact history of their financial default, the legal transfer of the deed to my corporate entity, and the strict 30-day timeline they had to vacate the premises before the county sheriff would be dispatched to physically remove their belongings and change the locks. It also included a detailed itemization of the back rent they owed me, which had been accumulating since the day my LLC purchased the debt. I took a slow, deep breath, enjoying the absolute quiet of my office. I moved my mouse over the print icon and clicked it. Across the room, the heavy industrial office printer hummed to life. The mechanical rhythm of the machine pulling blank sheets of paper and spitting them out covered in dense, undeniable legal facts sounded like a ticking clock. I stood up, walked over to the output tray, and gathered the thick stack of paper. It felt heavy in my hands. It was the physical manifestation of over a decade of financial abuse finally coming to a screeching permanent halt. I carried the stack back to my desk and placed it inside a vibrant blood-red presentation folder. I smoothed my hand over the glossy cover, sealing the documents safely inside. This was not just an eviction notice anymore. It was Justin's real graduation present wrapped and ready to be delivered. I sat back down in my leather chair and picked up my cell phone. The graduation party was exactly 2 days away. The luxury venue was booked, the family was officially divided by a lunatic email, and Patricia was blindly celebrating her imaginary victory. I opened my messages and scrolled down to Uncle Richard contact. He had been completely quiet since he walked out of Patricia's living room on Sunday afternoon, but I knew he was waiting patiently for my signal. I tapped the screen and typed a brief, simple message. "It is time. Pick me up at 6 on Saturday. Wear a nice suit." The reply came through less than a minute later. It was a single thumbs-up emoji, followed by a second message. "I will bring the good cigars. We are going to need them." I locked my phone, set it face down on my desk, and turned my attention back to my corporate audits. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was taken, and all I had to do now was get dressed up and crash the most expensive, deceitful party of the year. Saturday arrived with brilliant blue skies and a false sense of absolute victory for my mother. Across town at the Grand Heritage Country Club, Patricia was entirely in her element. She had rented out the most expensive ballroom on the property, a cavernous space dripping with massive crystal chandeliers and overflowing with towering centerpieces of imported white roses. The $20,000 I had wired into the escrow account was flowing freely, like water paying for an extravagance that she could never actually afford. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated the room carrying heavy silver trays loaded with beluga, caviar, artisan truffles, and endless flutes of vintage French champagne. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, adding a layer of sophisticated ambiance to the fraudulent celebration. Patricia stood dead center in the ballroom, wearing a custom-tailored designer gown she had undoubtedly charged to yet another maxed-out credit card. She was holding court with her wealthy country club acquaintances, completely intoxicated by her own manufactured reality. She laughed loudly, waving her champagne glass as she bragged about Justin. She told anyone who would listen that her genius son was launching a revolutionary tech empire, conveniently leaving out that his company existed only on a piece of paper. She boasted that she had personally gifted him $1 million estate to anchor his new legacy and provide a stable foundation for his brilliant career. Justin stood right beside her, wearing a graduation gown that felt more like a theatrical costume. He was soaking up the unearned admiration of local politicians and venture capitalists, men who had absolutely no idea they were talking to a heavily in-debt fraudster who still lived on his mother dime. They were both standing proudly on a glittering stage built entirely on lies, totally unaware that the trapdoor beneath their feet was about to swing wide open. While they were popping corks and celebrating their imaginary wealth, I was sitting in the dead quiet of my home office, meticulously orchestrating their destruction. I was not just printing eviction notices anymore. I had moved on to the heavy artillery. My industrial laser printer was methodically spitting out stacks of highly classified financial audit files. These were the documents I had compiled over the last month using my forensic access and federal tracking tools. Page after page detailed the exact paper trail of the $300,000 federal Small Business Administration loan Patricia and Justin had fraudulently obtained. They had not just lied on a bank application. They had stolen my social security number, forged my signature, and used my pristine credit history to secure federal government funds for Justin fake crypto startup. It was a textbook case of identity theft and wire fraud. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages and began sorting them into a dozen identical bright red presentation folders. Each folder contained a complete, undeniable dossier. I included bank routing statements, IP address logs from their home computer, and the most damning evidence of all, the forged character reference letters. Patricia had actually submitted fabricated letters of recommendation using the names and forged signatures of our own extended family members to bypass the loan underwriter scrutiny. I placed the folders neatly inside my thick leather briefcase, snapped the brass locks shut, and walked into my bedroom to get dressed. I bypassed the party dresses and chose a tailored emerald green business suit. It was sharp, perfectly fitted, and commanded absolute authority. I was not going to this party as a sister or a daughter hoping for a reunion. I was going as a corporate executioner. At exactly 6 o'clock, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. Uncle Richard was behind the wheel wearing a classic charcoal suit that made him look every bit the formidable estate lawyer he used to be before his retirement. I grabbed my briefcase, walked out the front door, and slid into the leather passenger seat. Richard looked at the heavy bag resting on my lap and gave a slow, knowing nod. He put the car in drive, and we glided out of my neighborhood, heading toward the country club on the other side of town. For the first 10 minutes, the only sound in the car was the soft hum of the engine and the faint sound of the radio. Then Richard finally spoke, his voice, gravelly and heavy with years of suppressed anger. "She really thinks she got away with it again," he said, keeping his eyes firmly on the road ahead. "She thinks she can just excommunicate you from the family, keep the house and brush you aside just like she did with the family trust." I turned to look at him, surprised he was bringing it up. We had rarely spoken about the family trust since my grandfather passed away a decade ago. Patricia had manipulated her way into being named the sole executor of his estate, and within 5 years the entire fortune had mysteriously vanished, leaving my aunts and uncles with absolutely nothing. Richard gripped the leather steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white. "I never had the physical, undeniable proof to take her to court back then," he confessed quietly. "The banking laws were different, and she covered her tracks just well enough to avoid a criminal indictment. But I knew exactly what she did. I knew she forged those distribution ledgers to fund her own lavish lifestyle while cutting your aunts and uncles out of their rightful inheritance. She stole from her own blood to buy country club memberships, luxury cars, and European vacations. She destroyed our family legacy, and then she blamed the real estate market crash to play the victim." Richard glanced over at me, his eyes flashing with a fierce protective intensity. "She has been playing this exact same game of theft and deception for her entire life, Madeline. She relies on the fact that family will always sweep things under the rug to avoid a scandal. But tonight is different. Tonight you have the paper trail I never had." I patted the smooth leather top of my briefcase and looked out the window at the passing city lights as we approached the grand entrance of the country club. "I have the paper trail," I agreed, softly feeling a cold rush of adrenaline in my veins. "And tonight, every single person in that ballroom is going to read it." We stepped out of the black sedan and handed the keys to the valet, who looked slightly intimidated by Richard's cold demeanor. The heavy double oak doors of the Grand Heritage Country Club loomed ahead of us, flanked by tall stone pillars and manicured hedges. I gripped the handle of my leather briefcase, feeling the solid weight of the documents inside. Richard adjusted his tie, gave me a single affirming nod, and reached out to pull the heavy brass handles. We pushed the doors wide open and stepped into the grand foyer, instantly bathed in the warm golden light of the massive crystal chandeliers. Beyond the foyer was the main ballroom, and it was in full obnoxious swing. The live jazz quartet was playing an upbeat tempo. Waiters were weaving through the crowd of relatives and local socialites. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck. At first, only the people standing near the entrance noticed us. A few cousins holding champagne flutes turned their heads, their eyes going wide with absolute shock. They immediately nudged the people next to them. Like a single drop of water freezing a pond, the silence spread rapidly outward from the doorway. The animated conversations died abruptly. The laughter simply stopped. Even the jazz quartet, sensing the sudden oppressive shift in the room atmosphere, faltered and stopped playing mid-note. The silence that fell over the cavernous ballroom was deafening. Every single pair of eyes in the room locked onto me. They had all read the unhinged email Patricia had sent that morning. They all knew I had been officially excommunicated, banned from the premises, and declared dead to the family. Yet here I was, standing tall in my tailored emerald suit, flanked by the one man Patricia feared more than anyone else. It took exactly 10 seconds for Patricia to spot us from her place at the center of the room. She had been holding court, a glass of vintage champagne in her hand, beaming with manufactured pride. When her eyes landed on me, the color completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling. The shock only lasted a fraction of a second before it was entirely consumed by a fiery, desperate rage. She slammed her champagne flute down on a nearby cocktail table, completely ignoring the liquid that splashed over the rim, and began marching toward us. She moved with aggressive, stomping strides, her heavy designer gown swishing violently around her ankles. The crowd of relatives parted instantly, clearing a path for her like a red sea of terrified bystanders. "What are you doing here?" Patricia hissed, her voice sharp and loud enough to echo across the silent room. "You are not welcome here. I made that abundantly clear to everyone this morning. Get out of this building right now before I have you thrown out in handcuffs." I stood my ground, not moving a single inch. "I am here to deliver a graduation gift, Patricia," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. "It is a very important document." I felt the entire family leaning in, hanging on every single word. Uncle Richard stood silently at my side, his hands clasped in front of him, fixing Patricia with a stare so cold it could have frozen boiling water. She refused to look at him, keeping her furious gaze locked entirely on me. "You have no right to be here," she screamed, her perfectly curated socialite facade crumbling into absolute hysteria. "I will not let you ruin my son's special day with your psychotic jealousy." Security. She turned her head wildly toward the doorway. "Somebody call the club manager and get security in here. This woman is trespassing." Before anyone could move toward the door, Justin stepped forward from the crowd. He was wearing his black graduation gown left unzipped over his custom suit, looking incredibly foolish and entirely out of his depth. But surrounded by his supposed high society network, his fragile ego demanded that he play the role of the protective man of the house. He puffed out his chest, trying to look physically imposing, and marched directly into my personal space. "You heard her," Justin demanded, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. "You need to leave, right now. You are embarrassing yourself, Madeline. You are acting like a crazy person because you cannot handle the fact that I am succeeding and you are just a miserable desk worker. Turn around and walk out that door, or I will personally drag you out by your arm." He took a step closer, raising his right hand as if he were actually going to grab my shoulder and physically force me out of the ballroom. I did not flinch. I did not take a step back. I just looked at his raised hand with absolute freezing contempt. Before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my suit, a massive shadow fell over us. A large, powerful hand reached out from the crowd and clamped down hard on Justin's wrist, stopping his movement instantly. The crowd gasped. Patricia let out a sharp shriek. It was DeAndre. He had materialized from the thick crowd of onlookers, stepping directly between me and my brother. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking immaculate and towering over Justin by at least 6 inches. DeAndre did not look angry. He looked completely relaxed, holding Justin's wrist in a vice grip with effortless strength, a dangerously calm smile playing on his lips. "I would not do that, little man," DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. He slowly and forcefully pushed Justin's arm down, forcing my brother to take a stumbling step backward. "She is wearing heels, but she will still put you in the emergency room. And I will stand right here and watch her do it." Justin rubbed his wrist, his eyes darting around the room, humiliated that he had just been physically overpowered in front of his potential venture capitalist investors. He looked at DeAndre with pure hatred, but lacked the courage to actually do anything about it. DeAndre, Patricia shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at her son-in-law. "How dare you put your hands on him? You are supposed to be family. You read my email. You are supposed to be on our side." DeAndre let out a short, booming laugh that shattered whatever remaining tension Justin had tried to build. "I am on the side of reality," Patricia, DeAndre replied smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "And right now, reality is holding a leather briefcase and looking like she is about to end your whole career." He took a deliberate step to the side, clearing the path between me and the stage at the front of the room. He gave me a respectful nod and gestured toward the microphone stand with an open hand. "Let the lady speak," DeAndre announced to the room. The crowd remained perfectly still, trapped in a state of terrified anticipation. Justin was completely neutralized, shrinking back into the crowd of relatives. Patricia stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing, without making a sound, realizing that her absolute control over the family had just been publicly severed. I stepped past them both, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor, making my way directly toward the stage, where Justin's fake empire was about to burn to the ground. Justin realized he was rapidly losing control of the room. As I made my way through the sea of tables, he broke away from the crowd and practically sprinted toward the front of the ballroom. He scrambled up the short flight of stairs to the stage, his black graduation gown billowing awkwardly behind him, almost tripping over the hem in his desperate rush. He lunged for the microphone stand set up in the center of the platform, frantically waving his hand at the jazz quartet to stop playing. The musicians immediately lowered their instruments, plunging the massive room back into an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Justin gripped the microphone with both hands. I could see the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead under the bright stage lights. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to project the image of a calm, collected executive, but his breathing was shallow and erratic. He was terrified, but his massive ego refused to let him surrender the spotlight. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Justin projected his voice echoing sharply off the high ceilings. He forced a wide, artificial smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. I know there was a brief interruption just now, but we are not going to let negative energy distract from this beautiful celebration. Tonight is about the future. It is about building something meaningful and leaving a lasting legacy. I did not stop walking. I maintained a steady, measured pace, letting my emerald heels click rhythmically against the floorboards, creating a slow countdown to his inevitable ruin. I reached the base of the stage stairs just as he decided to launch into the core of his delusional speech. I want to take a moment to publicly thank the most important woman in my life, my mother. Justin continued, his voice trembling slightly as he pointed toward Patricia, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the room. She has always believed in my vision. While some people in this world only care about hoarding their money and working meaningless corporate jobs to serve their own selfish egos, my mother understands true generosity. She understands what it takes to foster real innovation. He paused, scanning the room to make sure the venture capitalists and local politicians were paying close attention. He was desperately trying to secure his false narrative before I could dismantle it. The venture capitalists in the front row exchanged confused glances. They were seasoned businessmen who could smell desperation from a mile away, and Justin was practically sweating desperation from every pore. They shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly regretting their decision to attend what was supposed to be a high-level networking event, but was rapidly devolving into a suburban tragedy. Just this week, my mother formally gifted me the deed to our $1 million family estate, Justin announced proudly, practically shouting into the microphone. It is an incredible foundation for my new tech startup and a testament to the unconditional love and support that real family provides. She gave me a house unlike some bitter, jealous people who only know how to take. So please raise your glasses to my mother Patricia, a true matriarch and the backbone of my success. A few scattered, hesitant claps echoed through the room. Some of the older relatives raised their champagne flutes, casting nervous glances in my direction. They were trying to support Patricia, but the thick, suffocating tension in the air made it impossible for anyone to genuinely celebrate. The applause died out almost instantly, leaving Justin standing awkwardly on the stage, waiting for a roaring ovation that never came. That was when I placed my foot on the first wooden step of the stage. I had spent years being the quiet, compliant daughter. I had paid the bills, fixed the credit scores, and absorbed the emotional abuse so Patricia could maintain her fragile illusion of high society dominance. But as I climbed those wooden steps, I felt the final remnants of that old obedient girl burn away completely. I was not the family ATM anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. I walked up the stairs, slowly exuding an aura of absolute untouchable calm. I did not look angry. I did not look defensive. I looked like a woman who was completely in charge of the room. I stepped onto the platform and walked directly toward Justin. The stage lights were blindingly bright, casting harsh shadows across his pale, sweating face. As I closed the distance between us, I saw the genuine terror flashing in his eyes. He tightened his grip on the microphone, pulling it closer to his chest like a physical shield. "You need to get off this stage," Justin hissed under his breath, his voice barely audible over the hum of the sound system. "I am not letting you ruin this for me. Security is already on their way." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or engage in a petty tug of war. I simply reached out, placed my hand firmly over his sweaty fingers, and applied a sudden, unyielding pressure. I looked directly into his eyes, my expression utterly void of any sisterly affection. The sheer terrifying confidence in my gaze made his resolve crumble in an instant. He swallowed hard, his grip loosening just enough for me to smoothly slide the microphone out of his hands. He took a step back, completely defeated, looking like a little boy who had just been caught in a massive lie. I turned to face the audience. The ballroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Hundreds of eyes were locked onto me, waiting for the screaming match they assumed was about to happen. They expected me to yell to defend myself against Justin's thinly veiled insults, or to engage in a trashy public screaming match with my mother. Instead, I smiled. It was a warm, bright, perfectly polite smile that completely disarmed the room. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying clearly and smoothly through the high-end speakers. It sounded dangerously calm, dripping with a sweet, refined elegance that sent a visible shiver through Patricia standing in the crowd. "I am sorry for the dramatic entrance. I know I was not formally invited to this celebration, but I felt it was absolutely necessary for me to be here tonight." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the faces of my relatives, the wealthy socialites, and finally settling on my mother. She looked like she was about to faint, her manicured hands clutching the edge of a nearby table for physical support. "Justin is absolutely right about one thing." I continued, my tone conversational and pleasant. "Tonight is all about the future. It is about entering the real world and taking responsibility for the legacy we choose to build." He has been talking a lot about his new house and his massive tech startup. He has been talking about generosity and the importance of family support. I took a step closer to the edge of the stage, holding the heavy leather briefcase securely in my left hand. And since I am his older sister, I simply could not let him step into this exciting new chapter of his life without a proper contribution, I said, my voice softening into a tone of mock affection that cut deeper than any blade. I did not come here to ruin the aesthetic or start an argument. I just wanted to bring Justin his real graduation present. I turned my head and locked eyes with the DJ sitting at the soundboard booth just off the side of the stage. He was a young guy looking incredibly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in front of him. I gave him a sharp, commanding nod, signaling him to switch the visual input. The massive projector screen rolling down from the ceiling behind me was about to illuminate the darkest, most pathetic secrets my family had ever tried to bury. I took 3 steps toward the edge of the stage and reached into the front pocket of my leather briefcase. I pulled out a small silver flash drive. The young DJ, his eyes wide with the unfolding drama, did not utter a single word of protest as I leaned over his soundboard. I plugged the drive directly into the side port of his laptop. I navigated to a single PDF file on the desktop and double-clicked it. A sharp mechanical whir echoed above us as the heavy canvas projector screen fully unrolled from the ceiling, dwarfing the entire stage. The high-definition projector mounted at the back of the ballroom flared to life, casting a blinding white rectangular beam over the heads of the crowd. The image that flashed onto the massive screen was not a slideshow of childhood photos or a montage of Justin's supposed business achievements. It was the first page of the 30-page legal juggernaut I had printed in my office 2 days ago. Blown up to 10 feet tall, the document was impossible to ignore or misinterpret. In the top left corner, the official golden seal of the county clerk office glowed brightly. Dead center, written in bold, unforgiving black font, were the words, "Notice of foreclosure, eviction, and asset seizure." Below that, my corporate entity was clearly listed as the sole legal property owner, with Patricia and Justin named explicitly as delinquent tenants in severe default. I raised the microphone back to my lips. The feedback produced a sharp, metallic whine that forced everyone in the room to snap to absolute attention. "Justin," I said, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers with surgical precision. As the new legal owner of the family house, I am officially serving you with a 30-day eviction notice. You have until the end of the month to pack your things and vacate my property." The collective gasp that ripped through the ballroom sounded like all the oxygen being violently sucked out of the space. It was not a polite, restrained gasp. It was a loud, visceral reaction from 200 guests simultaneously realizing they were standing in the middle of a massive financial fraud. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so profound that I could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Then the whisper network activated and it was absolutely ruthless. It started in the front row, right where Justin had seated his prized venture capitalists and local politicians. These were men and women who analyzed risk and assessed wealth for a living. They did not need a law degree to understand what was projected on the screen behind me. One of the lead investors, an older man in a sharp silver suit who had been nodding along to Justin's speech just minutes earlier, abruptly stood up. He adjusted his tie, looked at Justin with an expression of pure disgust, and leaned over to whisper something to his colleagues. They immediately began gathering their coats and briefcases. They were not just leaving the party, they were permanently severing ties with a fraudster. Justin watched his entire professional future walk out the heavy oak doors, his mouth hanging open in silent panic. He looked back at the screen, then at the crowd, his eyes darting frantically as he realized the magnitude of his public execution. The brilliant tech founder persona had shattered into a million irreversible pieces. He was standing on a stage in a fake graduation gown, exposed to the city elite as an unemployed squatter who could not even afford his own rent. The whispers rippled rapidly backward into the sea of tables occupied by our extended family. The very same aunts, uncles, and cousins who had flooded my phone with hateful messages and religious guilt trips were now staring at the massive legal document with their jaws practically on the floor. Aunt Brenda, who had called me a greedy monster in the group chat, was violently shaking her head, squinting at the county seal as if trying to prove it was a forgery. But the legal jargon was airtight, the dates were exact, and the financial figures of Patricia's 6-month default were displayed for everyone to scrutinize. They began whispering furiously to one another, the volume in the room steadily rising like a boiling pot of water. "She did not steal it," I heard a cousin say, from the third row, his voice carrying clearly over the rising murmur. "The bank sold it. Patricia went broke." "Did Patricia lie to us?" another aunt gasped, clutching her pearls. "She said Madeline hacked the bank. This says they have not paid the mortgage in half a year." The illusion of Patricia generational wealth was burning to the ground right in front of them. The $20,000 catering bill, the imported roses, the vintage champagne, it all suddenly looked like exactly what it was. A pathetic, desperate masquerade funded by stolen money and deceit. Justin was trembling. He looked out at the audience, desperate for anyone to come to his defense. But his friends were staring at their shoes, his investors were gone, and his family was too busy unraveling the web of lies to care about his humiliation. He looked down at me, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred and absolute helplessness. "You ruined me," Justin whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the booming arrogance he had paraded into my office just days prior. "You ruined my life in front of everyone." I stepped closer to him, the microphone resting comfortably in my hand. "I did not ruin you, Justin," I replied, making sure the microphone caught every single syllable of my response so the entire room could hear it. "You ruined yourself the day you decided my hard work was your personal entitlement. I'm just holding up the mirror, now get off my stage." Justin staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. He turned around, stumbled down the side steps of the stage, and practically ran into the shadows at the edge of the ballroom, unable to face the hundreds of judging eyes burning into his back. The crowd was practically buzzing now. The whispers had turned into loud, overlapping conversations. The damage was done. The foreclosure was public knowledge. But this was only the first phase of my plan. Evicting Justin was just a matter of real estate. I still had the red folders in my briefcase, and the federal crimes Patricia had committed to fund this entire charade were about to push this family reunion into a criminal investigation. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my eyes scanning the chaotic room until they locked onto Patricia, waiting for her desperate counterattack. Patricia did not stay frozen for long. She was a cornered predator, and decades of manipulating country club gossip had trained her for exact moments like this. I watched her posture completely transform. The genuine terror on her face melted away instantly, replaced by a mask of profound, devastating tragedy. Her lower lip began to tremble violently. She brought a manicured hand up to her chest, clutching her expensive pearl necklace, as if her heart were physically breaking in two. She lunged toward the DJ booth. The young man, already terrified of being caught in the middle of our family warfare, practically threw his backup microphone at her to avoid a physical confrontation. Patricia gripped the black plastic cylinder with both hands and let out a loud, echoing, perfectly timed sob. The sound ripped through the murmuring crowd, instantly silencing the room once again. Every eye snapped away from the foreclosure notice on the projector screen and darted directly to my mother. "Please," Patricia cried out, her voice cracking with the heavy theatrical emotion of a grieving parent. "Please. Everyone, do not look at that screen. Do not listen to a single word she is saying." She took a few shaky steps toward the center of the dance floor, making sure the ballroom spotlights caught the artificial tears streaming down her carefully contoured cheeks. She looked up at me, standing on the stage, her eyes wide and pleading, playing the role of the ultimate victim flawlessly. "Madeline, how could you do this?" Patricia wailed, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "How could you humiliate your own family like this in front of our dearest friends? I knew you were unwell, but I never imagined you would sink to such psychotic depths." She turned to face the crowd, wiping a tear from her eye with the back of her hand. "She is sick," Patricia announced to the silent room, dropping her voice to a dramatic, sorrowful register. "My daughter is deeply, severely mentally ill. She has been struggling with extreme delusions and paranoid jealousy for years. We have tried everything to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs. We have paid for therapists, we have offered her endless support, but she refuses to accept reality." I stood perfectly still, watching her weave this complete fabrication out of thin air. She was weaponizing mental health to discredit a legal document, and she was doing it with terrifying conviction. "She cannot handle the fact that Justin is succeeding." Patricia continued, gesturing wildly toward the dark corner where my brother was still hiding. "She has spent her entire life stuck in a boring corporate cubicle, completely devoid of any real ambition. When she found out her father and I were gifting our estate to Justin to help launch his tech company, her mind completely snapped. She is obsessed with destroying him." She pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at the massive projector screen behind me. "That document is a complete fake. It is a sophisticated forgery. Think about it, everyone. Madeline is a forensic accountant. She spends all day manipulating digital PDFs and studying bank layouts. She knows exactly how to doctor a legal notice and slap a fake county seal on it. She fabricated this entire eviction notice just to publicly terrorize us and steal her brother's spotlight on the most important night of his life." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but in a room full of people desperate to avoid a messy reality, it was exactly what they wanted to hear. The truth was uncomfortable. The truth meant they had been worshipping a broke, manipulative fraud. Patricia Lie, however, offered them an easy out. It allowed them to write the whole incident off as the tragic actions of a crazy, jealous spinster sister. I saw the shift happen in real time. The skeptical whispers about Patricia finances completely stopped. Instead, the crowd began to look at me with a mixture of pity and rising anger. Aunt Brenda, who had always been Patricia's most loyal lapdog, was the first to break the silence. She slammed her champagne glass onto a table and marched to the front of the crowd. "Have you no shame?" Madeline Brenda shrieked, her face turning a bright, blotchy purple. "Look at what you are doing to your poor mother. She is completely heartbroken. Get down from that stage right now before I drag you down myself." Uncle Gary quickly stepped up right beside her, emboldened by the sudden shift in the room energy. "You are sick in the head, girl," Gary barked, pointing a thick finger at my face. "Your mother just told us you need a hospital, and honestly, I believe her. Forging legal documents to steal a house. You belong in a padded cell or a federal prison. Turn that projector off and get the hell out of this country club. The mob mentality ignited like gasoline on a dry fire. The older relatives, desperate to protect the family image, began shouting overlapping insults. Some yelled that I was a bitter old maid. Others demanded that someone call the police and have me arrested for criminal forgery and trespassing. The noise level in the ballroom skyrocketed, transforming the elegant graduation party into a chaotic, hostile arena. The venture capitalists who had been walking toward the exit paused at the heavy oak doors, watching the absolute spectacle unfold with morbid fascination. I glanced over at Rachel. She was sitting at a table near the back, her hands covering her mouth in pure horror as she watched our mother effortlessly assassinate my character. DeAndre stood firmly beside her, his arms crossed over his massive chest. He did not look worried. He looked directly at me and gave a slow, deliberate nod. He knew exactly what was inside my briefcase, and he knew Patricia was only digging a deeper grave. Justin, sensing the shift in the crowd, crept out from the shadows. He stood behind his mother, looking incredibly smug. His chest puffed out once again as he watched the family turn their collective rage entirely onto me. Patricia stood in the center of the floor, surrounded by her angry defenders. She brought both hands up to cover her face, her shoulders shaking as if she were overwhelmed by uncontrollable sobbing. But from my elevated position on the stage, I could see right past her hands. I saw the sharp, triumphant smirk spread across her lips. She thought she had won. She truly believed her emotional manipulation had successfully gaslit 200 people and neutralized the irrefutable evidence projected right behind me. The tension in the ballroom reached its absolute explosive peak. The yelling was deafening. The sheer hostility radiating from the crowd was enough to break anyone. But I did not break. I did not yell back, and I did not try to defend my sanity against a mob that had already made up its mind. I simply tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase. Let them scream. Let Patricia enjoy her stolen temporary victory. She had successfully convinced the room that she was an innocent, wealthy matriarch being victimized by a jealous daughter. But she had completely forgotten about the one man in the room who actually knew where all the bodies were buried, and he was already walking toward the center of the floor. Uncle Richard stepped out of the shadows and walked directly toward the center of the dance floor. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, measured confidence of a man who had spent 40 years dismantling liars in federal courtrooms. The heavy, chaotic noise of the ballroom began to die down the moment the crowd registered his presence. As the eldest surviving member of our family and a retired estate lawyer of immense reputation, Richard commanded a level of respect that Patricia could only dream of faking. The angry relatives who had just been shouting at me parted ways, instantly stepping back to give him a wide berth. Aunt Brenda lowered her voice and Uncle Gary crossed his arms, both of them looking at Richard with absolute deference, expecting him to deliver the final blow to my reputation. Patricia saw him approaching, and for the first time all evening, her theatrical sobbing actually hitched in her throat. Her eyes widened, darting nervously between Richard and the exit. She knew exactly what he represented. She tried to double down on her victim routine, taking a step toward him with her arms outstretched, as if seeking comfort from her older brother. "Richard, please," Patricia cried, forcing her voice to tremble. "You have to talk some sense into her. You have to tell them she is unwell." Richard did not offer her a comforting embrace. He did not even look at her with an ounce of sympathy. He walked right past her outstretched arms, reached out, and firmly pulled the microphone from her trembling hands. Patricia gasped, stumbling backward as if she had been slapped. Richard turned to face the crowd. He stood tall in his charcoal suit, his expression hardened into a mask of pure, unforgiving stone. He looked at Aunt Brenda, then at Uncle Gary, and finally let his gaze sweep over the rest of the silent, waiting family. "Stop this ridiculous charade right now," Richard commanded, his deep, gravelly voice completely dominating the room without him even having to yell. "My niece is not mentally ill. She does not suffer from delusions. She is one of the top forensic accountants in the state, and every single word she just said on that stage is the absolute, undeniable truth." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd, but Richard raised a single hand, instantly silencing them again. I stood beside her when she verified the property records. Richard continued, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I reviewed the bank transfers. Patricia defaulted on her mortgage 6 months ago. Madeline bought the debt to keep this family from being publicly humiliated by a sheriff eviction. She saved the house, and in return, Patricia tried to extort her for $20,000 to pay for this ridiculous party. Aunt Brenda stepped forward, her face pale, completely confused. But Richard, why would Patricia go broke? Her husband left her plenty, and she inherited the lion's share of Grandpa's estate. She has always had money. Richard let out a harsh, humorless laugh. He looked directly at Patricia, who was now physically shrinking away from him, her hands covering her mouth in genuine, unadulterated panic. She did not have money, Brenda Richards said slowly, making sure every syllable landed like a heavy stone. She had your money. She had Gary money. She had my money. The ballroom went deathly quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Uncle Gary dropped his arms to his sides, his aggressive posture completely vanishing. "What are you talking about?" Gary demanded, his voice suddenly very small. "I am talking about the family trust," Richard announced, turning to address the entire family. 10 years ago, when our father passed away, Patricia manipulated her way into being named the sole executor of the estate. She told all of us that the real estate market had crashed, that the investments had tanked, and that there was barely enough money left to cover the legal fees. She told us our inheritance was gone. Richard pointed a rigid finger directly at Patricia's face. She lied. The trust was perfectly healthy. The investments were generating massive returns. But instead of distributing the funds to the beneficiaries as dictated by the will Patricia forged the accounting ledgers, she secretly funneled every single penny into her own private accounts. The gasps from the audience were no longer theatrical or confused. They were visceral sounds of pure shock and mounting outrage. "She stole your inheritance!" Richard roared, finally letting his decades of suppressed anger rise to the surface. She drained the family trust to pay for her country club memberships, her luxury cars, and just an expensive European vacations. She bought this fake high society life using the money that was supposed to pay for your children's college tuitions and your retirement funds. She stole from her own blood. Aunt Brenda staggered backward, bumping into a cocktail table. She looked at Patricia with wide, horrified eyes. "My daughter had to take out student loans," Brenda whispered, her voice shaking with sudden violent anger. "We struggled for years, and you told me there was nothing left. You bought a Mercedes while I was working 2 jobs." Uncle Gary's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He took a heavy step toward Patricia, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You thief!" He spat, the venom in his voice so thick it could be cut with a knife. "You stood at Dad's funeral and cried on my shoulder, and you were robbing us blind the entire time." Patricia was completely surrounded. The very people she had just manipulated into attacking me were now closing in on her, their faces twisted with absolute fury. The mob she had weaponized had instantly turned around and pointed their pitchforks directly at her chest. She tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. She bumped into Justin, who was staring at his mother in complete horror, realizing for the first time that his entire life of privilege was funded by his mother, criminal embezzlement against their own family. "It is not true," Patricia choked out, her voice barely a squeak. "Richard is lying. He has always been jealous of me. He has no proof." Richard reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket. "I did not have proof 10 years ago," he corrected her, his voice dripping with icy satisfaction. "The banking laws protected your little shell game back then. But Madeline does not just look at current bank statements. She digs into the archives. She found the forged distribution ledgers. She found the offshore routing numbers. She found every single dime you stole from this family." He looked up at me, standing on the stage, holding the heavy leather briefcase. I gave him a slight approving nod. The family trust revelation had completely destroyed Patricia's social standing and her familial support. The flying monkeys were officially dead, but the true masterpiece of this evening was still locked inside my briefcase. The family trust was just a civil matter, a bitter dispute over inheritance. What I was about to reveal next was a federal crime that carried mandatory prison time. I stepped forward, raising the microphone to my lips once again, ready to drop the final devastating bomb. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia as the murmurs of the crowd faded back into a tense, expectant silence. Uncle Richard had just completely dismantled her past, leaving her stripped of her wealth and her dignity. She was shaking, looking around at the hostile faces of the family members she had robbed, but she still did not understand the true danger she was in. She thought the worst was over. She thought public humiliation and a civil lawsuit from her siblings were the ultimate punishments. She was wrong. I gripped the microphone and stepped directly into the center of the stage light. Patricia, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air. You spent this entire morning sending frantic emails to every person in this room. You told them I was mentally unstable. You told them I was a jealous, bitter woman who wanted to ruin Justin Big Day. You aggressively demanded that anyone who spoke to me be banned from this venue. I slowly paced the length of the stage, letting my words sink in. You tried to convince everyone that my mere presence would ruin the mood of this high society celebration. You acted like you were protecting your son from a toxic influence. But we both know that was a complete fabrication. You did not ban me from this party because you were worried about my attitude. You banned me because you were terrified of my profession. You were terrified that if I walked into this room, I would finally put the pieces together. I stopped pacing and looked directly down at my mother. The sheer panic in her eyes was intoxicating. Mother, you didn't disinvite me because I ruined the mood. You did it because you and Justin used my social security number to take out a $300,000 federal SBA loan for Justin's fake crypto startup. The crowd goes absolutely dead. It was a silence so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that the entire ballroom felt like a vacuum. No one whispered. No one gasped. The sheer magnitude of the accusation paralyzed every single person in the room. Stealing from a family trust was a despicable betrayal. But defrauding the federal government using a stolen identity was a massive life-destroying felony. Justin let out a strange, strangled sound from the shadows. He stumbled forward a few steps, his face completely drained of blood, looking like he was about to physically collapse. I did not give them a single second to recover. I spoke clearly and methodically, dissecting their crime with the precision of a surgeon. 2 months ago, Justin decided he wanted to be a tech CEO. I explained, projecting my voice to the very back of the hall, where the venture capitalists were still standing, completely captivated by the disaster. But a fake cryptocurrency company with zero revenue and zero product does not qualify for a federal Small Business Administration loan. You need verifiable income. You need pristine credit. You need a guarantor with a flawless financial history. I gestured toward Patricia, who was now clutching her chest, struggling to breathe. Patricia's credit was completely destroyed by her mortgage default and her maxed-out credit cards. Justin has never held a real job in his life. So they needed a ghost. They needed someone whose financial profile could withstand federal underwriting. I looked right at Justin. You logged onto the dark web, bought a cheap IP masking software, and submitted a federal loan application using my name, my social security number, and my corporate tax returns. You forged my digital signature on 30 pages of federal banking documents. You routed the $300,000 directly into a shadow account under your fake company name, and then you immediately started spending it. I pointed my finger at the expensive crystal chandeliers above us. You spent it on this venue. You spent it on vintage champagne and imported caviar. You tried to use it to secure a luxury sports car. You were burning through federal funds to play pretend, and you thought you could just hide the paper trail by keeping me away from you. You thought if you kicked me out of the family, I would never check my own deep credit history. Patricia finally found her voice. It was a weak, pathetic rasp. It was a mistake, she whimpered, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. We were going to pay it back. Justin just needed a little seed money to get started. His company is going to be huge. We were going to pay off the loan before you ever found out. It was just a temporary family loan, Madeline. You have to believe me. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. A family loan, I repeated, shaking my head in pure disbelief. Mother, you do not accidentally commit wire fraud. You do not accidentally steal your daughter's identity and lie to the United States government. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated, malicious federal crime. I turned my attention back to the crowd. Uncle Richard just exposed a civil dispute, I told them, my voice ringing with absolute authority. But what Patricia and Justin did to me crosses state lines. It involves federally insured institutions. That means it falls directly under the jurisdiction of the FBI. The penalty for aggravated identity theft and wire fraud is a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Justin let out a loud, panicking sob. He ripped off his graduation cap and threw it onto the floor, pulling at his own hair. He looked at his mother with a wild, cornered expression. "You told me it was safe," Justin screamed at her, his voice cracking hysterically. "You said she would never check. You said she was too busy with her own clients to notice a credit inquiry. You ruined my life." "I am not done," I interrupted sharply, cutting off his pathetic breakdown. You see, Patricia knew the SBA underwriter would eventually ask for character references and business affidavits to verify Justin Fake Company. She needed people to vouch for his character and his business acumen. But she could not ask anyone in this room, because then you would all know about the money. I walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the edge of the stage. I popped the brass latches and pulled out the thick stack of bright red presentation folders. "So she did what she does best," I announced, holding the folders up for the entire room to see. "She lied. She stole your identities, too. She forged character reference letters using the names, addresses, and forged signatures of almost every single aunt and uncle in this room. She made you all unwitting accomplices to a federal crime." The dead silence in the ballroom instantly shattered into a roar of absolute chaos. I looked down at DeAndre, who was standing at the bottom of the stage stairs, a wide, predatory smile on his face. I handed him the stack of red folders. It was time for the family to see exactly how much their loyalty to Patricia had cost them. DeAndre took the heavy stack of red presentation folders from my hands. He did not rush. He moved with the casual, confident swagger of a man handing out winning lottery tickets, though these tickets only promised federal indictments. He walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, bypassing the silent, stunned guests, making a direct line for the family members who had been screaming at me just 5 minutes earlier. He stopped right in front of Aunt Brenda. She was still gripping the edge of a cocktail table, her face pale and shining with nervous sweat. DeAndre held out a folder. "Special delivery, Aunt Brenda," he said, his deep voice dripping with mock politeness. "You might want to check page 4. I hear your creative writing skills are absolutely phenomenal these days." He tossed another folder onto the table in front of Uncle Gary. "And for you, Uncle Gary, a certified copy of your glowing recommendation. I had no idea you were such a massive financial supporter of cryptocurrency startups. You kept that a real secret from all of us." DeAndre moved swiftly through the crowd, handing folders to Cousin Kyle, Aunt Susan, and several other vocal relatives who had eagerly jumped on Patricia's bandwagon of hate. The ballroom, which had been buzzing with chaotic noise, fell into a frantic, rustling silence as the recipients ripped open the glossy red covers. They flipped past the bank routing statements and the IP address logs, their eyes frantically scanning the heavy black text until they reached the final section of the dossier. Aunt Brenda reached page 4 and froze. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers. She brought the paper closer to her face, her hands shaking so violently the page audibly rattled. It was a formal business affidavit submitted directly to the Federal Small Business Administration. The letter passionately vouched for Justin, incredible business acumen, and unparalleled integrity. It explicitly stated that Brenda had personally reviewed his business model and found it to be a risk-free, guaranteed success. Furthermore, it listed her as a senior advisory board member for his fake tech startup. At the very bottom of the page, sitting perfectly on the signature line, was Aunt Brenda, full legal name signed in black ink. "I did not sign this," Brenda whispered, the breath completely leaving her lungs. Then her voice escalated into a deafening, piercing shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I did not sign this. I have never seen this piece of paper in my entire life." Uncle Gary was staring at his own folder. His face, already flushed from his earlier anger toward me, turned a dangerous, mottled shade of crimson. "This says, I am a silent partner," Gary bellowed, his deep voice shaking the crystal glasses on the nearby tables. He slammed his fist down hard. "This says, I pledged $50,000 in personal assets as collateral for this fraudulent federal loan. Patricia, what the hell is this? The relatives surged forward, completely abandoning their previous loyalty. The mob mentality shifted instantly, transforming from a weapon aimed at me into a firing squad aimed directly at Patricia. They formed a tight, aggressive circle around her. She was trapped in the center of the dance floor, physically shrinking away from the furious, twisted faces of her own siblings. It was just a formality, Patricia pleaded, throwing her hands up in front of her face as if bracing for a physical blow. The bank required character references to release the funds. I knew you would all say yes if I asked you, so I just sped up the process to save time. It does not mean anything. Nobody was ever going to check the signatures. It was just standard paperwork. I stood on the stage watching her desperately try to minimize a massive felony. I brought the microphone back up to my mouth. It is not just paperwork when you submit it to the federal government, I corrected her, making sure my voice carried clearly over the shouting crowd. It is aggravated identity theft. You use their names, their home addresses, and their financial reputations to secure government funds under false pretenses. When the FBI audits that loan, and they absolutely will audit that loan, every single person holding a red folder is going to be listed as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud investigation. The word co-conspirator hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. Cousin Kyle, who had previously called me a corporate parasite, actually dropped his folder on the floor and backed away as if it were radioactive. "I am not going to federal prison for you," Kyle screamed at Justin, pointing a shaking finger at my brother. "I have a job interview next week. I am not getting a federal criminal record because you wanted to pretend to be a tech billionaire." The outrage reached a fever pitch. Aunt Susan was crying hysterically, pulling her phone out of her expensive purse to call her own lawyer. Uncle Gary looked like he was ready to strangle Patricia with his bare hands. He crumpled the forged document into a ball and threw it right into her face. It bounced off her cheek and fluttered to the ground, landing at her expensive designer heels. "You dragged us into your criminal mess," Gary roared, stepping so close to Patricia she had to lean back to avoid him. "You stole our inheritance and now you are trying to steal our freedom." DeAndre stood off to the side, leaning casually against a decorative stone pillar. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a low, echoing whistle. "Man," he said loudly, shaking his head with a wide grin. "I appraise commercial properties for a living, but I have never seen a family value drop this fast. You all need federal defense attorneys, not vintage champagne." Justin tried to take advantage of the blinding chaos. While the family was entirely focused on screaming at his mother, he took a slow step backward. He was trying to slip away toward the service exit behind the jazz quartet empty chairs. He was perfectly willing to abandon Patricia to the mob and run out the back door to save himself. But Uncle Gary caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. Gary lunged forward, grabbed Justin by the collar of his black graduation gown, and violently yanked him back into the center of the angry circle. "You are not going anywhere, you arrogant little thief," Gary spat right in his terrified face. "You are going to stand right here and explain exactly how you stole my identity." Patricia was sobbing uncontrollably now. Her perfect socialite makeup was completely ruined, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streaks. Her expensive designer gown looked utterly ridiculous amidst the brutal criminal accusations raining down on her. She looked up at me on the stage, her eyes begging for mercy, silently pleading for me to stop the relentless avalanche of truth. But I had absolutely no mercy left to give. The paper trail was completely exposed, the family was in absolute uproar, and the final piece of the trap was already speeding down the highway toward the country club. Uncle Gary tightened his grip on the collar of Justin's graduation gown, lifting my brother slightly onto his tiptoes. Justin's eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked at the circle of furious relatives closing in around him. He saw Aunt Brenda clutching the forged affidavit, her face twisted with rage. He saw the wealthy investors who had lingered near the exit pulling out their phones to record the spectacular implosion of his fake tech empire. The pressure was too much. Justin had spent his entire life being shielded from the consequences of his own actions, wrapped in a protective bubble of Patricia delusions. The moment that bubble popped, he completely shattered. He did not try to defend his mother. He did not try to explain the situation or apologize to his family. He went straight into survival mode, and his only strategy was absolute betrayal. "She made me do it!" Justin screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Patricia, who was standing just a few feet away. "It was her idea. I did not even know how to apply for a federal business loan. She is the one who bought the IP masking software. She is the one who stole Madeline's social security number. She forced me to sign those papers." The entire ballroom gasped again, watching the supposed brilliant CEO instantly reduce himself to a terrified, sniveling child, throwing his own mother directly under the bus. "I did not want to steal anyone's identity," Justin sobbed desperately, trying to pry Uncle Gary's thick fingers off his collar. "She told me it was the only way. She said we had to keep up appearances because her country club friends were starting to ask questions about our finances. She said she needed me to look like a massive success so she would not look like a failure. I was just doing what she told me to do. She manipulated me." Patricia stopped sobbing instantly. The artificial tears dried up the second those words left Justin's mouth. The desperate pleading victim act vanished, replaced by a look of profound, venomous betrayal. She stared at her golden child, the son she had sacrificed her own family, her integrity, and her freedom to protect. He was publicly sacrificing her to save his own skin, and the psychological whiplash was spectacular to witness. Patricia's entire body went rigid. Her face flushed a dark, dangerous red, and the veins in her neck bulged against her expensive pearl necklace. "You ungrateful, spineless little brat!" Patricia shrieked, her voice tearing through the ballroom like a chainsaw. She lunged forward, not at Uncle Gary, but directly at Justin. She slapped her hands against his chest, pushing him back with surprising force. "I did everything for you. I ruined my life to give you everything you ever wanted, and this is how you repay me. You are blaming me for your own pathetic failures." Justin stumbled back, but he did not back down. The fear in his eyes was rapidly transforming into vicious, defensive anger. "I am a failure because of you," Justin yelled right back in her face. "You never let me do anything on my own. You treated me like a trophy to show off to your rich friends. You bought me that stupid Porsche just so you could take pictures with it. You forced me to start a fake company because you were too embarrassed to admit your son was unemployed. You are a toxic, narcissistic psycho." The ballroom was treated to the ultimate raw destruction of the golden child and the narcissistic mother. They were standing in the middle of a rented luxury venue, screaming the most vile, deeply buried truths at each other in front of 200 people. "I stole that trust fund because you were too stupid to get an academic scholarship," Patricia roared, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of innocence. She was publicly confessing to the embezzlement just to hurt him. "I forged those ledgers because you failed out of your first college and I had to bribe your way into a second one. You have never worked a hard day in your miserable life. You are nothing without me. You are a weak, pathetic little boy playing dress-up in a suit I bought for you. I only needed a suit because you went bankrupt trying to pretend you were old money." Justin spat back, his face twisted in absolute disgust. "You are the one who lost the house. You are the one who defaulted on the mortgage while you were busy buying designer bags you could not afford. Madeline is right. You are a criminal. And when the FBI gets here, I am going to tell them everything. I am going to testify against you to get immunity. I will watch them lock you away." Patricia let out a guttural scream of pure rage. She raised her hand to strike him across the face, but Aunt Brenda and Cousin Kyle stepped in, grabbing her arms and pulling her back. They were not protecting Justin. They were just treating Patricia like the dangerous, unhinged criminal she had finally admitted to being. The two of them stood there panting heavily, glaring at each other with a hatred so deep it was almost hard to watch. The perfect mother and son duo, who had spent decades looking down on the rest of the world, had completely devoured each other the second their backs were against the wall. There was no loyalty. There was no love. It was just two parasites fighting over a sinking ship. I stood on the stage watching the total collapse of their toxic empire. I did not need to say another word. They had done my job for me. They had confessed to the financial fraud, the federal loan scam, and the trust fund embezzlement on a public stage, destroying whatever tiny shred of credibility they had left. Down on the floor near the edge of the furious crowd, DeAndre reached out and calmly picked up a full glass of vintage champagne from an abandoned silver tray. He took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the crisp liquid cool his throat. He looked at the screaming match, then looked up at me on the stage, a massive, thoroughly entertained grin spreading across his face. "Man," DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a perfect note of absolute satisfaction. "I love family reunions." I smiled back at him, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of freedom. The heavy chains of obligation and guilt that Patricia had wrapped around my neck for over a decade were finally shattered into dust. But the grand finale of this evening was not just about exposing their crimes to the family. It was about facing the actual legal consequences of their actions. And right on cue, the heavy oak doors of the country club swung open, and the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers announced that reality had officially arrived. The piercing wail of sirens shattered the tense atmosphere inside the ballroom. It started as a faint, distant howl echoing down the long, winding driveway of the Grand Heritage Country Club, but it rapidly multiplied. Within seconds, the sound grew into a deafening, overlapping chorus of emergency vehicles rushing toward the main entrance. The heavy velvet curtains draped over the floor-to-ceiling windows suddenly illuminated. Intense flashes of violent red and piercing blue lights began strobing through the glass, painting the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the guests in harsh, alternating colors. Patricia's head snapped toward the windows, her eyes wide with a feral, instinctual terror. The reality of the word federal had finally pierced through her thick layers of delusion. This was not a family argument she could manipulate her way out of. This was not a country club scandal she could smooth over with a fake smile and a new designer dress. The United States government had arrived, and they were parking directly outside the front doors. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, dropped her expensive beaded clutch onto the polished hardwood floor, and bolted. She did not run toward the main entrance. She spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the room for an escape route, and locked onto the swinging wooden doors leading to the catering kitchen. She shoved past Aunt Susan, nearly knocking the older woman over, and frantically pushed her way through the tight circle of furious relatives. She was a woman possessed, kicking off her designer heels so she could sprint faster across the slick dance floor. She honestly believed that if she could just make it through the kitchen and out the service exit, she could disappear into the night and somehow outrun the consequences of her entire life. "Mother!" I said, my voice booming through the microphone, completely devoid of panic or urgency. "You cannot outrun a digital footprint." Patricia froze halfway across the dance floor. The sheer authority in my voice hit her like a physical brick wall. She slowly turned around her chest, heaving her bare feet planted on the cold wood, looking up at me with the frantic desperation of a trapped animal. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" I asked, leaning slightly over the edge of the stage. "Do you think the federal agents outside are just going to let a woman in a ball gown sprint across the golf course?" "You have nowhere to run, Patricia." I made absolutely sure of that on Wednesday morning. Uncle Richard stepped forward from the crowd, blocking her path to the kitchen, just in case she decided to make a break for it again. He stood with his arms crossed, watching his sister ultimate downfall with cold, silent satisfaction. Patricia swallowed hard, her chest rapidly rising and falling. Wednesday, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the blaring sirens outside. "What did you do on Wednesday?" I smiled, a genuine, deeply satisfying smile. "I answered your phone call, Patricia. You called me at 8 in the morning and aggressively demanded $20,000 to pay the final catering deposit for this exact party. You threatened to ruin my reputation with the entire family if I refused. You thought you were so incredibly clever, forcing the daughter you despised to foot the bill for your golden child fake celebration." I took a slow step down from the stage, bringing the microphone with me, walking deliberately toward where she stood, trembling in the center of the room. "I agreed to send the money very quickly, did I not?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. I did not fight you, I did not argue, but I told you I had to use a secure third-party escrow portal to transfer the funds. I told you it was just standard compliance for high net worth transfers, and you were so blinded by your own greed and vanity that you did not even bother to read a single word of the document you digitally signed. Justin, who had been completely immobilized by terror, suddenly looked up. His eyes darted between me and his mother, a new wave of sickening realization washing over his pale face. That escrow account was not a standard banking portal, I revealed, letting the absolute weight of the truth crush the remaining air out of the room. That account was directly monitored and logged by federal agents. It was a digital honey trap, Patricia. I had already filed a comprehensive identity theft report regarding the fraudulent small business loan. The investigators had the paper trail, but they needed undeniable proof of your current active involvement in financial manipulation crossing state lines. They needed you to authorize a transaction. I stopped walking, standing just 10 feet away from her. When you typed your full legal name and clicked accept on that wire transfer, you authorized the movement of $20,000 across state lines under fraudulent pretenses. You confirmed your IP address. You confirmed your identity. You officially committed interstate wire fraud right from your living room sofa. The ballroom erupted into another wave of shocked murmurs. The venture capitalists in the back of the room were aggressively whispering to each other, completely mesmerized by the flawless, lethal execution of the financial trap. "You caught yourselves," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The money that paid for these imported white roses. The money that paid for the vintage champagne you have been drinking all night. The money that paid for this entire venue, it was all perfectly tracked bait. By accepting that money to throw a party for a fake company, you handed the FBI the final nail in your own coffin." Patricia's legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the heavy fabric of her expensive gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she let out a long, agonizing wail of total defeat. She had spent decades building an impenetrable fortress of lies, manipulating everyone around her and stealing from her own blood. But in the end, her insatiable greed and her desperate need to show off to her country club friends had been the exact instruments of her destruction. Justin slowly backed away from her, staring at the floor as if he was going to be physically sick. He looked at the half-empty glass of champagne sitting on a nearby table, suddenly realizing that every sip he had taken tonight was bought with a federal crime that he was entirely complicit in. He was wearing a graduation gown for a degree he barely earned, celebrating a company that did not exist, standing in a house of cards that had just been incinerated. The heavy red and blue lights continued to flash violently through the tall windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the walls. The wailing sirens outside abruptly cut off, replaced by the loud, aggressive screeching of tires against the pavement and the heavy slamming of multiple car doors. The federal agents had secured the perimeter. There was no back door left to slip through. There were no more lies left to tell. The time for talking, manipulating, and playing the victim was officially over. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung inward with a loud, authoritative crash. 6 federal agents strode into the room, their dark windbreakers clearly displaying the bold yellow letters FBI across the back. They moved with military precision, completely ignoring the lavish decorations and the stunned gasps of the wealthy guests. 2 local police officers trailed closely behind them, securing the exit to ensure nobody attempted to slip away. The jazz quartet, who had been sitting frozen in their chairs during the family meltdown, practically scrambled backward against the far wall to stay out of the way. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped silver hair, walked directly onto the center of the dance floor. He did not ask for the manager. He did not announce his presence to the room at large. His eyes scanned the chaotic circle of relatives until they landed squarely on Patricia, who was still slumped on the floor in her deflated designer gown, and Justin, who was standing frozen just a few feet away. "Patricia," the agent said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of emotion. "Justin, we need you to stand up and place your hands where we can see them." Justin let out a high-pitched squeal that sounded like a terrified animal. He immediately threw his hands into the air, the wide sleeves of his graduation gown sliding down past his elbows. He backed away from his mother, desperately trying to put physical distance between himself and the woman who had orchestrated his downfall. It was her idea, Justin babbled hysterically, tears streaming down his face as two agents flanked him. I swear to God it was her idea. I did not want the loan. I did not want the money. She forged the papers. She made me sign them. Please, I have my whole life ahead of me. Do not arrest me. One of the agents grabbed Justin by the arm and firmly spun him around. You have the right to remain silent, the agent recited in a bored, practiced tone, completely unfazed by Justin's sobbing. I suggest you use it. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the silent ballroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Justin, the golden child who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, was now standing in a fake graduation gown with his wrists securely locked behind his back. He looked over at his venture capitalist investors who were watching his arrest with expressions of absolute disgust. His reputation, his fake company, and his freedom were entirely gone. Meanwhile, Patricia was not going quietly. As two agents approached her, she scrambled backward across the polished hardwood floor, her hands scrambling against the slick surface. No, Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with pure terror. No, this is a mistake. You do not understand. I am a respected member of this community. My husband was a successful businessman. You cannot do this to me. Ma'am, stand up, the lead agent commanded, stepping forward. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Patricia scrambled to her feet, swaying unsteadily on her bare feet. She looked frantically around the room, desperately searching for a lifeline. She looked at Uncle Richard, but he simply turned his back to her. She looked at Aunt Brenda and Uncle Gary, but they were glaring at her with absolute unforgiving hatred. Finally, her wild, manic eyes locked onto me standing on the edge of the stage. Madeline. Patricia cried out, stumbling toward me before an agent grabbed her by the shoulder to stop her. Madeline, please. You have to tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them it was just a family dispute. Tell them I had your permission to use your name. Please, Madeline, I am your mother. You cannot let them take me away in handcuffs. I will die in prison. She was crying genuine tears now. The arrogant, wealthy socialite who had demanded $20,000 from me just 3 days ago was completely gone. She was begging me for mercy in front of the entire country club. I looked down at her. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel vindictive. I just felt an overwhelming sense of pity for a woman who had destroyed her entire life, just to impress people who did not even care about her. I slowly walked down the short flight of stairs from the stage. The federal agents watched me closely but did not intervene. I stopped just 2 feet away from Patricia, looking directly into her red, swollen eyes. I know you are in debt, Mother, I said, my voice quiet but perfectly clear, carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. But I am not paying this one off. Patricia let out a guttural wail as the lead agent firmly grabbed her arms and pulled them behind her back. The handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. She struggled briefly, twisting her shoulders, but the agents held her securely. Take them out, the lead agent ordered. The 2 agents marched Justin toward the exit. He was crying so hard he was practically hyperventilating, his head hung low in absolute shame. Patricia was led out right behind him, her expensive gown dragging across the floor, completely ruined. The wealthy guests and the furious relatives parted silently, watching the matriarch of the family being escorted out of her own lavish party in federal custody. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off Patricia, frantic sobbing. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, we all watched in total silence as they were loaded into the back of 2 separate unmarked federal vehicles. The doors slammed shut, the engines roared to life, and the cars sped off down the long driveway, taking the toxic core of my family away forever. The taillights of the unmarked federal vehicles disappeared into the dark night, and the heavy, stunned silence inside the Grand Heritage Country Club finally broke. It did not return to the polite hum of a high society gathering. It instantly devolved into a chaotic, panicked scramble for legal survival. The relatives who had so eagerly defended Patricia just an hour ago, the same people who had called me a monster and demanded my arrest, were now completely unglued. They were like rats trapped on a rapidly sinking ship, turning on each other in their desperate bid to escape the rising water. Aunt Brenda was pacing frantically near the abandoned caviar station, her face entirely devoid of color. She had her cell phone pressed so tightly to her ear that her knuckles were turning white. She was screaming at her husband to wake up their family lawyer, sobbing hysterically that she was going to be indicted for a federal crime she knew absolutely nothing about. Uncle Gary was aggressively cornering the country club manager near the coat check, demanding copies of the venue security footage to prove he had no part in organizing the fraudulent graduation event. Cousin Kyle was sitting on the edge of the hardwood dance floor, his head buried deep in his hands, rocking back and forth as he realized his corporate job interview next week was completely doomed by his association with a federal fraudster. The wealthy venture capitalists and local politicians had already vanished, fleeing the ballroom the second the federal agents had walked through the doors. They were desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout, leaving behind half-empty champagne glasses and a shattered illusion of a tech empire. The lavish graduation party was entirely shut down. The jazz quartet quietly packed up their brass instruments and slipped out the side door without asking for their final payment. Waiters began silently clearing the tables, removing the expensive imported roses and untouched plates of food, pretending not to hear the frantic legal threats being hurled across the room. I stood near the edge of the stage watching the absolute destruction of my family toxic empire. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel an ounce of regret. For my entire life I had been their designated scapegoat. I had been the reliable financial safety net they happily exploited and the convenient villain they blamed for their own miserable failures. Tonight, I had simply handed them the mirror they had been avoiding for decades. I reached down, closed the leather flap of my briefcase, and snapped the heavy brass latches shut. The sharp metallic click felt incredibly final. I turned around and walked away from the frantic, screaming crowd of relatives. I did not say goodbye to a single one of them. I found Rachel, DeAndre, and Uncle Richard waiting for me near the grand entrance foyer. Rachel looked exhausted, the emotional toll of the evening clearly weighing heavily on her shoulders. But when she looked at me, there was a profound sense of relief in her eyes. She reached out and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, genuine hug. It was the first time in years I felt like I actually had a real sister. We pulled away, and Uncle Richard gave me a firm, proud nod of approval. We pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out of the venue together. The cool, crisp night air hit my face, carrying the fresh scent of the manicured golf course and instantly washing away the suffocating tension of the ballroom. The contrast between the chaotic, screaming nightmare inside the club and the peaceful, quiet night outside was staggering. We walked slowly down the wide stone steps toward the valet stand, leaving the drama, the lies, and the financial ruin completely behind us in the glowing venue. As we waited for the valet to bring our cars around, DeAndre turned to face me. He adjusted his sharp navy suit jacket, shoved his hands casually into his pockets, and a wide, predatory grin spread across his face. He looked back at the Grand Country Club, listening to the faint sounds of arguing still echoing from inside, then looked directly down at me. So DeAndre said, his deep voice carrying a perfect note of casual business. Since the house is currently vacant and the former tenants have been permanently relocated to federal holding cells for the foreseeable future, you are going to need a good commercial realtor to list the property. I happen to know a guy who appraises real estate for a living. I could not help it. I threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. The sound felt completely foreign and incredibly wonderful. It was the laugh of a woman who had finally dropped a massive, suffocating weight off her shoulders. I reached into the pocket of my emerald blazer, pulled out the heavy brass key to the family estate, and tossed it through the air. DeAndre caught it effortlessly with one hand, his grin widening even further. "It is all yours, DeAndre," I told him with a bright, victorious smile. "Sell it to the highest bidder. I never want to see that house again." The valet pulled my sleek sedan up to the curb, leaving the engine running. I hugged Rachel one last time, shook Uncle Richard's hand with deep gratitude, and slid into the driver's seat. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the country club. I drove down the long, winding road, watching the grand building fade into the darkness in my rearview mirror. For the first time in 33 years, my bank accounts were secure. My name was entirely cleared, and my future belonged entirely to me. I was completely victorious, and more importantly, I was finally free. Sometimes walking away from the people who share your blood is the exact thing you must do to save your own life. Family is supposed to be a foundation of support, not a financial prison built on manipulation and lies. Thank you for staying with me through this incredible journey. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and financial success? I would love to read your stories of survival and independence in the comments section below. If my story gave you the courage to stand up for your own worth today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories. Remember, you do not owe your success to people who only view you as an asset. Protect your peace, know your absolute value, and never let anyone make you feel guilty for demanding the respect you rightfully deserve.